Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where old myths, buried cities, and the stranger corners of the ancient world are allowed to slow down a little and keep you company for the evening. Tonight our attention turns toward a creature with a name that does not come up nearly as often as it should, which is a shame, because if ever a being deserved a calm late-night introduction, it may be this one. We're going to spend some time with the Bashmu, an ancient dragon of Mesopotamian tradition, a creature tied to fear, power, divine conflict, and the long memory of civilizations that like their monsters large, meaningful, and difficult to forget. It is the sort of figure that waits quietly in the edges of old texts, not always centre stage, not always described the same way every time, but always carrying that useful ancient quality of making people feel that the world was older, sharper, and perhaps less domesticated than it appeared at first glance. Before we get comfortable with this dragon, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. There is something fitting about that, I think. A story from the oldest cities on Earth, travelling through wires and signals and screens, arriving in your room at whatever hour you happen to need it. And if you find this soothing, or interesting, or simply a good way to let the day loosen its grip a little, then do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this quiet little corner reach more people who enjoy strange history, old gods, and the occasional monster with a very respectable pedigree. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin, because somewhere between the first city walls, the first temple towers, and the first human attempts to describe chaos in a shape they could name, there coils the story of the Bashmu. When modern people hear the word dragon, a whole parade of images usually rushes in at once. Fire, wings, treasure piles. Knights with poor odds, a village somewhere in grave danger, perhaps a castle, a brave speech, and an ending that works out suspiciously well for the humans. Ancient Mesopotamia had no obligation to follow that script, and very often it did not. Its monsters were not built for fantasy novels or amusement parks. They were tied to the structure of the world itself. They lived in myths that asked serious questions about order, kingship, danger, disease, divine authority, and what exactly was lurking beyond the edges of cultivated land and civilized control. In that setting, a dragon was not just a big reptile with an anger problem. It could be a sign of cosmic disorder, a weapon of a deity, a memory of primeval violence, or a symbol of the kind of power that ordinary people would much prefer to keep at a respectful distance. The Bashmu belongs to that world. It comes from a civilization that looked at floods, storms, deserts, snakes, illness, and war, and did not conclude that life was safe and tidy. Quite the opposite. The Mesopotamians were brilliant observers of the fact that life could become dangerous very quickly. Rivers gave crops, but rivers also destroyed fields. Kings built walls, but enemies still appeared. Priests made offerings, but sickness still entered homes. So when they imagined threatening beings, those beings were not decorative. They had a job to do. They gave shape to fear. That is one of the first things worth noticing about the Bashmu. Creatures like this did not appear because ancient people lacked imagination, or because they needed bedtime scares before electric lighting. They appeared because human beings are very good at turning danger into an image. Give a fear a body and you can talk about it. Give chaos scales, fangs, venom, and a name, and suddenly it can enter a myth, a prayer, an incantation, a king's inscription, or a temple tradition. It becomes something the culture can wrestle with. Not always successfully, of course. Ancient religion was not a customer service desk where one filled out a complaint and received immediate protection from dragon-related problems. But naming mattered, story mattered, symbol mattered. The Bashmu was part of a language of threat. It helped communicate that the world was not fully tamed, that powerful beings existed beyond normal human reach, and that the gods themselves sometimes ruled through forces that were not gentle or familiar. Even the shape of the creature matters. Serpentine beings appear again and again across cultures for reasons that are not especially mysterious. Snakes move in unsettling ways. They can seem silent and sudden at the same time. Some carry venom. Many people fear them without needing a long philosophical argument. Now make that serpent larger, stranger, more monstrous, and place it in the hands of myth, and it gains the weight of something bigger than an animal. It becomes an idea with teeth. Mesopotamia was especially good at that kind of thinking. This was a region filled with temple economies, scribal schools, royal propaganda, legal codes, flood stories, omens, astronomical observations, laments, hymns, and epics. It was practical and symbolic at once. The same civilization that could keep grain records and develop sophisticated systems of writing could also populate its imagination with gods, hybrid creatures, underworld beings, and terrible attendants of divine wrath. To modernize, there is sometimes a temptation to separate these things too sharply, as though administration was real life, and myth was some charming side hobby people turned to after doing their taxes in cuneiform. Ancient Mesopotamians would not have seen it that way. Their cosmos was layered. Politics, religion, nature, illness, kingship, and the unseen world all leaned into one another. A monster in a myth could tell you something about how power worked. A dragon in a divine conflict could reflect concerns about the fragility of order. A creature invoked in ritual language could express the fear that harmful forces could cross into human life at any time. So when we approach the Bashmu, we are not just meeting a beast. We are entering a whole system of thought in which danger was never merely random. It had pedigree, it had place, it had meaning. And there is another reason the Bashmu deserves a slow introduction. Figures like this are easy to flatten. They get pulled into modern ancient aliens talk, fantasy aesthetics, internet summaries, or quick lists of forgotten monsters. And before long, the creature has been reduced to a label with very little weight behind it. But these old names were carried by scribes, priests, and storytellers who lived in one of the earliest urban civilizations on Earth. They were not inventing things casually. Even when accounts varied, even when a creature's role changed from one text to another, it still belonged to a serious symbolic world. That is especially true when we start brushing up against the word Anunnaki, which has acquired an impressive amount of modern luggage. In the oldest Mesopotamian setting, the Anunnaki were divine beings, a group of gods associated in different ways with power, the underworld, cosmic order, and the larger divine assembly depending on time and context. They were not originally the science fiction executives of the solar system, no matter how enthusiastically later speculation may try to recruit them into that role. But it is precisely because the modern world has piled so much onto these terms that it helps to return to the older material with patience. The Bashmu becomes more interesting, not less, when it is allowed to live where it was born, in the mythic and ritual imagination of Mesopotamia, where serpentine monsters could serve as enemies, emblems, attendants, or signs of the dangerous edge between order and chaos. What makes old dragon stories so durable, I think, is that they sit right on the border between the familiar and the impossible. Human beings know what a snake is. We know what claws are, what teeth are, what venom is, what a predator feels like. A dragon takes those known elements and scales them upward until ordinary fear becomes cosmic fear. It is not just that the thing could bite you, it is that the thing suggests a world where human beings are not the final authority. There are larger powers moving around. Some of them are ancient. Some of them are divine. Some of them are only partly knowable. Mesopotamian civilization, with all its brilliance, had no reason to think the universe was arranged for human comfort. Their gods could be generous, but they could also be severe. Their myths did not promise that the world would always make emotional sense. In fact, one of the striking things about ancient Near Eastern literature is how directly it confronts instability. Cities rise and fall, kings boast and die, floods come, disease spreads, empires shift. A dragon in that environment is not just spectacle. It is an efficient summary of the fact that force exists beyond negotiation. You do not reason with a storm, you endure it, pray through it, name it, write about it, and hope the gods who outrank it are in a cooperative mood. That also helps explain why creatures like the Bashmu can move through different kinds of material. A monster may appear in myth, in ritual, in lists of dangerous beings, in imagery, or in learned traditions that classify the population of the unseen world with a seriousness that would almost be comforting if some of the inhabitants were not so unpleasant. The ancient mind, contrary to cliché, was not careless with categories. Mesopotamian scholars loved lists. They named stars, plants, stones, omens, gods, professions, cities, and yes, unsettling beings. To classify something was not to dismiss it. Quite often it was the opposite. Classification was a way of managing reality, of saying that if a thing existed in the world, whether visible or invisible, it should be named properly and placed within a system. That habit gives figures like the Bashmu a certain sturdiness. Even when the surviving evidence is fragmented, even when modern readers wish the tablets would simply state everything clearly in one convenient paragraph, the creature still emerges from a world that took such beings seriously enough to preserve them, and preservation matters. Ancient texts break, libraries burn, clay cracks, whole archives disappear, yet some names survive. Bashmu is one of them. There is something else quietly interesting here, and it has to do with memory. Monsters often preserve old fears for a very long time. Sometimes a dragon is a dragon, and sometimes a dragon is a cultural storage box for everything people do not trust. Wilderness, floodwater, serpents, disease, invasion, divine punishment, primal rebellion, the threat of nature against settlement, the threat of the gods against arrogance, the threat of old powers returning when order weakens. One creature can carry a surprising amount. That may be one reason dragon and serpent figures remain so persistent across civilizations. They are useful containers for anxiety. They can be local and cosmic at once. A snake in the field can kill one farmer. A mythic serpent can threaten the structure of the world. The Bashmu sits within that old pattern. Its very presence hints that Mesopotamians were not only describing a beast, but storing a way of thinking about danger. And because myths are not static museum labels, that danger could shift. A creature might be linked to chaos in one setting, divine service in another, and symbolic power in a third. Old mythic beings are rarely polite enough to stay in one box. This is where the story starts to become especially rewarding, because the Bashmu does not live alone. Mesopotamian tradition is full of strange company. There are serpent beings, storm beings, underworld demons, hybrid guardians, monstrous attendants, and creatures tied to great divine conflicts. Some are hostile, some protect, some do both depending on who is asking. A modern listener might want a simple answer to the question, so is the Bashmu good or bad? Ancient myth rarely offers such easy customer support. The better question is usually, in what context? Was the creature an enemy in a cosmic struggle? Was it an emblem of the kind of force a god could command? Was it something named among dangerous beings? Was it close to the memory of older serpent traditions that stretch back through multiple cultures and languages? Mesopotamia lasted a very long time and involved Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and others across centuries of change. Meanings could accumulate, names could travel, traits could blur. That is not a flaw in the material. It is part of what makes it worth following. Old traditions behave more like rivers than filing cabinets. They branch, merge, carry debris, and pick up unexpected things along the way. For tonight, though, we do not need to rush ahead and pin every scale into place immediately. It is enough to get comfortable with the atmosphere in which the Bashmu belongs. Picture the broad alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, where cities rose from mud brick and labour, where temple towers marked the skyline, where kings made claims in stone and clay, where scribes pressed wedge-shaped signs into tablets that would outlive empires. Picture a world in which people watched the rivers closely, read omens seriously, and understood that civilization itself was a hard-won arrangement against disorder. In such a world, the dragon is not out of place. It makes sense. It is what the imagination produces when people know that order must be defended, that power has teeth, and that behind the visible world there may always be older forces waiting for their turn. The Bashmu carries that feeling. Even its name seems to arrive from the dust with a warning attached. Not loud, not theatrical, just a reminder that the ancient world had its own vocabulary for dread. And perhaps that is the best way to open this journey. Not by treating the Bashmu as a curiosity in a cabinet, and not by turning it into a modern fantasy mascot, but by meeting it as the ancient world likely preferred to meet such beings, with caution, interest, and a healthy respect for what stories like this were meant to do. They were not only there to entertain, they explained, they warned, they organised fear. They helped people imagine how the world became ordered, how it could fall into disorder, and what kinds of beings stood on either side of that line. Soon enough we will get closer. We will ask what the Bashmu actually was, how it was described, where it appears, and why dragon forms mattered so much in the worlds of gods and kings. We will move through older serpent traditions, divine battles, temple imagination, and the long survival of ancient monsters into later memory. But before any of that, it helps to stay here for just another moment, at the threshold, with the name itself and the feeling it carries. Because the first step in understanding the Bashmu is not to imagine a fairy tale creature soaring over a castle. It is to enter the Mesopotamian mind slowly enough to notice why a dragon had to exist there at all, and why once it did, it was never going to remain a small thing. If someone says the word dragon, most of us immediately picture something enormous, theatrical, and probably insured against castle damage. A winged beast circles overhead, somebody in armour starts making questionable life choices, and somewhere nearby there is a pile of treasure that really ought to have been stored more sensibly. But the ancient world, and Mesopotamia in particular, had its own ideas about what a dragon was, and those ideas were older, stranger, and in some ways much less interested in being entertaining than our modern versions. The Bashmu belongs to that older world. It is one of the dragon or serpent-like beings that emerge from the texts and traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, and the first thing worth saying about it is that it was not imagined as a cheerful fantasy creature or a convenient villain for a hero to defeat before dinner. It belonged to a civilization that took monsters seriously, not because its people were gullible, but because they lived in a world where danger was serious, power was serious, and the boundary between order and chaos always felt thinner than people would have liked. To meet the Bashmu properly, it helps to begin with a simple adjustment. We have to stop thinking of the dragon as a genre creature and start thinking of it as part of a religious and symbolic system. In Mesopotamia, creatures were rarely just decorative. They carried meaning, they stood for forces, they could represent divine power, cosmic threat, disease, disorder, punishment, or old realities that civilization itself was trying to keep under control. This was the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the region that gave rise to some of the earliest cities, some of the earliest writing, some of the earliest kings whose names we still remember, and also some of the earliest recorded monsters. That is not accidental. When human beings first began building cities on a large scale, organising labour, raising temples, recording omens, and thinking seriously about how order is maintained, they also began describing what threatened that order. The Bashmu is one of those descriptions. Now, the name itself is sometimes translated or understood in ways that point us toward a venomous serpent or dragon-like being. That alone already tells us something useful. The Bashmu is not a soft creature, not a vague symbol, and certainly not the sort of beast one keeps as an exotic pet. unless one is a god with absolutely no respect for ordinary household safety. It is tied to the imagery of the serpent, and serpents in the ancient Near East carried a whole set of associations that are not hard to understand even now. They move in unsettling ways. They can strike suddenly. Some are venomous. They appear low to the ground and difficult to predict. They are quiet when they are calm and alarming when they are not. A great many cultures looked at snakes and concluded quite sensibly that there was something primeval about them. Mesopotamia was no exception. When the serpent form becomes larger, more monstrous, and more deeply woven into mythic tradition, you begin to approach the terrain in which a being like the Bashmu can exist. It also helps to remember that Mesopotamian myth did not arrange the universe into neat little shelves for modern convenience. Gods, demons, monsters, hybrid creatures, and dangerous beings existed in overlapping categories. Some could be enemies of order, some could be servants of a god, some could function as emblems of divine authority, some could turn up in incantations or lists of harmful beings, some could be all of those things depending on which text, which period, and which ritual context you were looking at. That can be frustrating if one is hoping for a clean answer on the order of the Bashmu was exactly this and only this. But ancient traditions are rarely that accommodating. The better approach is to ask what kind of creature it seemed to be, what feelings it carried, where it belonged in the imagination of the culture, and why its form mattered so much. One useful comparison is to think about how modern people use the word storm. A storm can be weather, but it can also be a mood, a threat, a metaphor for conflict, or a way of describing political unrest, inner turmoil, or a bad family gathering at Christmas. Ancient cultures did something similar with monsters, except their monster language was often much more tightly connected to religion and cosmology. The Bashmu was not simply a strange animal with a memorable name. It was part of a way of talking about dangerous force. It may appear in relation to other monstrous beings and in traditions that cluster around chaos, divine warfare, or threatening entities known in ritual and learned texts. When a Mesopotamian scribe or priest encountered such a name, they were not just reading fantasy, they were engaging a meaningful category within the structure of the world as they understood it. This is why the phrase ancient dragon can be helpful, but only if we use it carefully. If by dragon we mean a large, serpentine, terrifying creature associated with destructive power, then yes, Bashmu fits comfortably enough. But if by dragon we immediately import later European expectations such as wings, fire breath, and a personal interest in sitting on gold, we start missing the point. Mesopotamian dragons and serpent monsters often feel more elemental than storybook dragons. They're not just beasts with personalities, they're embodiments of threat. They're attached to old struggles between order and disorder. They can represent the dangerous side of divine power, or the memory of a world before the present order was secured. Even when they are named and described, they often feel older than the text itself, as though the culture is recording something already ancient in its own imagination. The Bashmu becomes easier to understand when placed beside the larger family of serpent and dragon imagery in Mesopotamia. This is a world that knew beings like the Mushkushishu, that strange and famous dragon associated especially with Marduk and other serpent-like monsters tied to divine conflict and cosmic disorder. Not every creature is identical, of course. The Bashmu is not just another label pasted onto every reptilian horror in the region. But the broader environment matters. Mesopotamian religion had room for dangerous composite beings, monstrous attendants, underworld threats, and chaos creatures linked with divine enemies. So when the Bashmu appears, it is not arriving in an empty stage. It belongs to an established bestiary of meaningful terror. There is also the question of scale. Ancient monsters are often large not because ancient people had an obsession with oversized reptiles, but because scale communicates importance. A small snake is dangerous. A great serpent dragon is cosmic. The bigger the being, the less it feels like ordinary nature, and the more it begins to represent something structurally important. It becomes the kind of thing that belongs in creation stories, divine battles, or lists of threatening powers that needed naming, ritual control, or theological explanation. The Bashmu, then, is not just a frightening animal enlarged for dramatic effect. It is a being that signals escalation. When the serpent becomes Bashmu, we are beyond natural hazard and entering mythic hazard. And that brings us to one of the most interesting parts of the whole subject. Ancient Mesopotamia was a civilization obsessed, in the best possible way, with naming. It named stars, professions, stones, plants, omens, gods, diseases, months, cities, and classes of beings. Naming was a way of ordering reality. To name something was to acknowledge it as part of the system. That did not mean people controlled it. Human beings have named plenty of things they still cannot control, including hurricanes, tax codes, and whatever is happening with printer settings. But naming does allow a culture to think clearly about danger. If a threatening being has a name, it can appear in learned lists. It can enter incantations. It can be classified beside others. It can be discussed, invoked, warded against, or remembered in myth. Bashmu survives to us as a name partly because Mesopotamian civilization was so good at preserving its categories in writing. There is something wonderfully sober about that. Ancient Mesopotamians did not simply say, "There are scary things out there somewhere." They said more or less, "Yes, and here is what they are called, and here are some related beings, and here is the ritual language you may need if one of these categories becomes relevant to your evening." That tells us a lot about the culture. It was not sloppy in the way it imagined the unseen world. It was methodical, serious, at times almost bureaucratic, which is very on brand for one of the earliest civilizations built on records, administration, and scribal training. Even the monsters, in a sense, entered the archive. So what did the Bashmu likely look like in the imagination? This is where we have to move with some care. Ancient texts do not always provide the kind of full, neat, modern creature profile people would love. No tidy card appears saying height, habitat, temperament, dietary preferences, and whether it gets along with other monsters. Instead, we reconstruct from names, descriptions, related traditions, and contexts. Bashmu is tied to the serpent form, often understood as venomous, dangerous, and monstrous. That already gives us a creature defined by threat, not beauty. Even when ancient art or text is fragmentary, the serpent dragon logic remains strong. Elongated body, fearsome presence, association with poison or deadly attack, and a place among those beings that belong not to the ordinary barnyard but to the deep mythic imagination of the region. Venom matters here more than it might at first seem. Poison is one of the most efficient symbols of invisible danger. A fang punctures the body, but the real harm unfolds inside. That makes venomous beings especially good symbols for forces that enter human life with devastating results. Illness behaves this way. Misfortune can feel this way. Divine punishment can be imagined this way. A serpent whose danger lies not just in its bite, but in what it transmits becomes more than an animal threat. It becomes a fitting image for destructive force itself. The Bashmu's serpentine and venomous associations therefore place it close to a whole symbolic field of harmful penetration, corruption, and deadly agency. At the same time, Mesopotamian monster imagery is rarely only about raw fear. It is also about power. The thing that terrifies is often the thing that fascinates. Kings wanted symbols of strength. Gods were imagined with fearsome attendants or terrible enemies, precisely because power is more convincing when it has something formidable to command or defeat. A dragon-like being can therefore function in different directions at once. It can be the emblem of what threatens order, but also a demonstration of the power required to master that threat. That is one reason ancient Near Eastern art and mythology can seem so full of monstrous forms. They were not simply indulging in dark imagination. They were staging authority. The more terrible the creature, the more impressive the god or king who stood above it. This may be one of the reasons why the Bashmu feels both specific and slightly elusive. It is specific enough to carry a name and a tradition, but broad enough to belong to a larger language of serpent power in Mesopotamia. It is the sort of being that may have lived in the overlap between mythic narrative, learned classification, and ritual imagination. For the people who preserved its name, that overlap was not a problem. It was normal. The same culture that built ziggurats and recorded business transactions also copied incantations, myths, omen texts, and lists of beings that moved through the edges of the visible world. The Bashmu therefore belongs not to fantasy in our sense, but to a total worldview in which religion, nature, fear, order, kingship, and cosmic history all spoke to one another. There is another angle worth considering, and that is age. Serpent monsters often feel old, even within old traditions. They give the impression of being leftovers from the first, rougher version of the universe. Before cities, before laws, before kingship is fully secured, there is something coiled and dangerous in the dark. That is a powerful image, and Mesopotamian myth often seems to understand it instinctively. The world is not born tidy. It is won into order. Gods fight. Forces oppose one another. Chaos does not politely step aside because a city has been founded. It has to be beaten back, named, contained, or enlisted. A creature like the Bashmu carries the smell of that earlier stage of reality. It feels like something older than the walls, older than the temples, older than the administrative confidence of civilization. That may sound dramatic, but it is also very practical. Civilizations need stories about how order exists because order is never automatic. Mesopotamia knew war, flood, collapse, dynastic change, plague, and invasion. It knew that human arrangements are fragile. Monster traditions help societies talk about that fragility. A dragon is not only a beast, it is what disorder looks like when you give it a body. In that sense, to ask what was the Bashmu is partly to ask what did the Mesopotamians think threatened the world they had built. The answer is not always literal. It may include natural hazards, divine anger, inherited mythic patterns, and the general awareness that underneath civilization there is always something less cooperative waiting. And yet, ancient people did not only fear such beings, they studied them, listed them, incorporated them, and sometimes transformed them into signs of controlled power. This is the fascinating double movement of the ancient dragon. First, it is the enemy. Then, once subdued or associated with a victorious god, it becomes part of the visual language of authority. Human beings do this all the time. We turn dangers into emblems once we believe someone powerful has mastered them. The lion becomes royal. The eagle becomes imperial. The dragon becomes divine property. That does not make the creature harmless. It makes it useful. In Mesopotamia, a terrifying being could move from the side of threat to the side of legitimacy depending on who was imagined standing over it. So when we meet the Bashmu, we are meeting several things at once. We are meeting a serpent dragon of Mesopotamian tradition, marked by danger and old fear. We are meeting a creature preserved by one of the earliest literate civilizations, which means its name survived because it meant enough to be copied. We are meeting part of a larger family of monstrous beings through which Mesopotamia imagined chaos, poison, divine conflict, and the edge of order. And we are meeting a reminder that the ancient world did not divide the symbolic from the practical nearly as much as we do. A dragon could be theology, memory, warning, and classification all at once. That is why the Bashmu matters. Not because it gives us another nice item for a list of forgotten monsters, but because it opens a door into how Mesopotamia thought. It shows us a civilization that looked at danger and did not reduce it to superstition or to simple animal fear. Instead, it built a language around it. It gave threat a form, placed that form in relation to gods and cosmic struggle, and preserved it in texts serious enough to outlast empires. Once you start seeing the Bashmu that way, It stops being an odd name from a distant myth and starts becoming a clue to how ancient people understood the world, how they imagined chaos, and why the dragon shape was so effective for carrying those ideas forward. And from there, the next step becomes almost unavoidable. Because once we know that the Bashmu was not just a monster, but a specific kind of serpent power in the Mesopotamian imagination, the obvious thing to ask is where such a creature came from in the first place, and why the ancient world kept returning to serpent beasts when it wanted to talk about the oldest and most dangerous forces it knew. Long before Babylon gave dragons glazed brick, and long before Assyrian kings carved their victories into palace walls, the world that would eventually produce the Bashmu was already learning how to imagine danger in the shape of a serpent. That is where we have to go now. Not to the great imperial capitals that usually get the dramatic lighting, but further back into the older Mesopotamian landscape, when cities were smaller, kingdoms were still learning how to become durable, and the distance between ordinary life and the forces people feared was felt in a very immediate way, before empires rose, before the great royal titles multiplied, before the gods were organised into the kinds of systems later scribes would preserve so carefully. There was already water, mud, reeds, marshland, floodplain, and the stubborn human effort to build order inside a place that could become unruly very quickly. It was a world that did not need much encouragement to take snakes seriously. That point may seem obvious, but it matters more than it first appears. Mesopotamia was not a land of mountains and forests, in the way some later mythic cultures imagined their monsters. Much of southern Mesopotamia was a broad alluvial plain shaped by rivers, canals, marshes, cultivated fields, shifting waters, heat, and the constant practical labour of keeping life organised. This was the environment in which some of the world's earlier cities emerged. Human beings were building homes from mud brick, managing irrigation, storing grain, raising temples, and inventing the administrative habits that would eventually become the backbone of civilization. But nature did not politely disappear because humans had made a schedule. The rivers could flood, the ground could crack in heat, marshes could hide things, reeds could rustle for reasons one did not immediately enjoy. Snakes belong to that environment in a completely natural way, and when a culture begins from such a setting, the serpent is never going to feel like an abstract idea. It begins as a fact of life. From there, the symbolic expansion comes almost naturally. A real snake can kill. A larger snake can dominate a story. A serpent associated with a god can cross into religion. A monstrous serpent can carry the weight of everything people fear about the untamed side of existence. And this process does not require a single author sitting down one afternoon and saying, "I believe I shall invent an ancient dragon now." It happens over generations. People fear certain animals, observe them closely, speak about them, exaggerate them, connect them to divine qualities, merge them with other old motifs, and eventually build a creature larger than anyone's sighting or memory could explain. That is why the earliest roots of beings like the Bashmu are so hard to pin to one perfect beginning. They rise from accumulated experience. They are not just invented, they condense. If we go far enough back into Mesopotamian culture, what we find is not yet the fully organised world of later Babylonian theology, but a deep reservoir of serpent imagery, chthonic imagery, and dangerous hybrid beings that already tells us the old imagination was moving in that direction. Even the earlier settled communities of the region live close to the realities that make serpents meaningful. Snakes emerge from hidden places. They belong to holes, reeds, ruins, riverbanks, and thresholds. They appear without much ceremony. They can vanish just as quickly. They are close to the earth, and because they move along the ground and disappear into it, cultures repeatedly connect them with underworld forces, hidden knowledge, death, rebirth, and everything that comes from below. Mesopotamia was no exception. Before there was an empire polished enough to present an official cosmic image, There was already a world in which the serpent could mean danger, hidden power, subterranean force, and the part of nature that civilization did not fully control. That early world is important because it reminds us that the Bashmu did not come from nowhere. It belongs to a much older family of thought. In the same way a later royal palace is built on older foundations, a later dragon is usually built on earlier serpent fears. The human imagination works by accumulation. If a creature survives for centuries in myth, it usually carries traces of multiple older things inside it. A venomous snake from daily life, a marsh danger, a symbol of the underearth, a sign of divine hostility, a memory of storm and flood chaos, a temple image attached to a god, a monstrous being from a story about cosmic struggle. All of those layers can eventually settle into one name. Bashmu is one of those names. It also helps to remember that the divine world itself was old before the empires were old. The Anunnaki, in the broad mythic sense the user wants us to inhabit here, belong to a divine order that later traditions organized and reimagined across centuries, but the roots of their world stretch back into much earlier religious habits. Before the great imperial systems made theology more formal and more politically useful, local gods and old sacred powers already shaped how communities understood reality. Some gods were tied to cities, some to fertility, some to storm, some to wisdom, some to the underworld, and many had attributes that do not fit neatly into later expectations. Serpent associations appear around several of these older divine worlds. That is important because it means serpent beasts were not only enemies from outside order. Sometimes they were close to the gods themselves. The serpent could be hostile, but it could also be sacred, protective, royal, healing, or deeply bound up with divine identity. That double role is one of the reasons the earlier serpent beasts feel so alive in Mesopotamian thought. They were not just one thing. A modern mind often wants a clean split between monster and symbol, but ancient religions are more flexible than that. A creature may be terrifying and sacred at the same time. It may represent what threatens order, yet also serve as the emblem of the god strong enough to master that threat. It may come from the underworld, but also guard a threshold. It may embody poison, but also hint at knowledge or authority that comes from hidden places. In early Mesopotamia, that complexity was not considered untidy. It was normal. The world itself was layered, and the serpent, perhaps more than most animals, was perfectly built to move through those layers. One of the recurring features of the oldest Mesopotamian religious imagination is the strong presence of what we might call below-world power. That does not always mean evil in the later moralized sense. It means that what is beneath the surface matters. Water beneath the earth matters. The underworld matters. The fertile silt left by rivers matters. Buried seeds matter. Hidden realms matter. Snakes, by their habits and appearance, fit this symbolic field with unnerving ease. They emerge from holes. They disappear into cracks. They seem close to death and close to renewal. They shed skin, which gives them an almost rude talent for looking ancient and renewed at the same time. It is no wonder that serpent imagery becomes connected with old gods, underworld domains, and powers that feel primordial rather than recent. Before empires rose, people were already living in a universe where what came from below could nourish, threaten, or both. That older religious terrain helps explain why later Mesopotamian dragon forms do not feel like sudden inventions. They feel inherited. Somewhere in the oldest layers of memory there is already the idea that serpentine beings belong close to the origins of power. When later texts describe monstrous serpent forms in divine conflict, they are not inventing serpent danger from nothing. They are drawing from a symbolic vocabulary already centuries old. Even the great cosmic battles of later mythology carry the flavour of something inherited. Chaos takes reptilian, marine, or hybrid form because those forms had long carried the right emotional charge. They were ancient enough, dangerous enough, and close enough to nature's hidden violence to serve. and that hidden violence was not theoretical. Mesopotamia was a civilization built in a difficult place. Its achievements were extraordinary, precisely because they were not automatic. Irrigation required planning. Agriculture required labour and cooperation. City life required management. Temples required surplus. Kingship required legitimacy. All of this existed under conditions where disorder was always one bad season, one failed canal, one invading army, or one epidemic away. In such a setting, myths about monstrous beings were not idle decorations. They provided scale. They took the reality that order is fragile and expressed it in memorable bodies. A serpent beast could stand for the untamed world outside the levees, the uncertainty beneath political life, or the old hostile powers that even gods had to confront. Before empires rose, people were already living with that awareness. The serpent therefore enters their imagination very early, not because it was exotic, but because it was useful. If we look at the broad arc of Mesopotamian myth, we can feel this ancient serpent logic gathering strength. Early sacred imagery and divine symbolism around serpents, dragon-like beings, and hybrid monsters eventually create the conditions in which later named creatures become possible. Some of these beings are closer to animals enlarged by fear. Others are already mythic composites. Some are tied to particular gods. Others appear in narrative as enemies or agents of chaos. The point is not that every serpent in early Mesopotamia was secretly the Bashmu in disguise. The point is that the Bashmu emerges from a very old environment in which the serpent had already become one of the main visual languages for power, that was dangerous, hidden, ancient, and not fully human. That becomes even clearer when we think about how early Mesopotamians imagine the first age of the world. In many mythic systems, the earliest time is rougher than the present order. Things are larger, less settled, less divided into their proper places. Gods are still establishing rank. Waters still need separation. Boundaries still need definition. This does not mean ancient people imagined a literal zoological era in which giant dragons politely wandered around, waiting for theologians to notice them. It means that when cultures imagine beginnings, they often fill them with beings that express unformed power. Serpents and dragons are very good at that. They feel pre-civilized. They seem to belong to the stage before roads and walls and law codes. So when later Mesopotamian tradition places monstrous serpent beings into the deep mythic past, it is doing something quite intuitive. It is giving primordial danger the right body. That is one reason the world of the Anunnaki in mythic memory is so full of beings that do not fit ordinary categories. The gods are not dealing only with polite abstractions. They move among storm powers, sea powers, underworld powers, demons, monstrous attendants, and creatures that belong to the first dangerous architecture of the cosmos. A being like the Bashmu does not feel out of place there because the divine world itself retains traces of primordial conflict. Even when later theology becomes more orderly, those older textures remain. The gods are rulers, yes, but they are rulers over a universe that was never completely neat. The serpent beast is part of the proof. There is another early factor worth noticing, and that is artistic memory. Long before a creature is fixed in a written narrative, it can exist in visual motifs, ritual objects, seals, carved forms, or repeated patterns that carry meaning forward. Ancient art does not always label itself helpfully for modern readers. It does not write, "This is a precursor to a later dragon concept," beneath every figure, which would admittedly have been convenient. But hybrid animals, serpent forms, horned beasts, and composite sacred creatures appear early and often enough to show that Mesopotamian visual culture was comfortable with beings that exceeded the ordinary natural world. Once a civilization begins imagining power in such mixed and heightened forms, it is already training the eye for later dragons, and the eye matters because monsters are not just told, they are seen. Even when described in text, they rely on visual expectation. A serpent beast works because the audience already knows what to fear in the shape. They know the body is elongated, close to the ground, difficult to grasp, capable of sudden attack. Add horns, increase size, heighten deadliness, or place the being in divine company, and the mental image becomes strong very quickly. That is likely one reason serpent and dragon forms proved so durable in Mesopotamia. They were efficient. You did not need many lines to make the threat vivid. A serpent enlarged by myth is immediately legible. Before empires rose then, the essential ingredients were already in place. There was a real environment where snakes belonged. There was a symbolic world that connected serpents with hidden, under-earth, and dangerous power. There were early gods and sacred systems in which such imagery made sense. There was artistic imagination comfortable with composite and heightened beings. There was a social reality in which order felt fragile and therefore needed mythic language big enough to express that fragility. Put those together over centuries, and the emergence of named serpent monsters becomes not surprising at all. It becomes almost inevitable. The Bashmu, in that light, is not the beginning of the story, but one of its later, clearer faces. Behind it stands a long prehistory of serpent fear and serpent meaning. Behind it stand reeds moving in marsh wind, unseen things in riverbanks, old underworld associations, local cult traditions, sacred animals, dangerous animals, and the first urban societies trying to explain a world that could feed them and destroy them in the same season. Behind it stand early divine systems, in which the gods were not distant from natural threat but entangled with it. Behind it stands the oldest human instinct of all, perhaps, which is to look at what frightens you and give it a form large enough to match the feeling. And once that process is underway, serpent beasts stop being merely creatures and become part of cosmic history. They move from field fear to myth, from myth to theology, from theology to ritual, from ritual to kingship, from kingship to cultural memory. That is how old monsters survive, not by remaining simple, but by becoming useful at multiple levels. The earlier serpent beasts in the Mesopotamian world were useful because they gave shape to danger before the great empires formalized how danger should be described. They belonged to the old layer underneath the polished version of civilization, and because of that, they retained a certain authority even later. A dragon from the deep past always feels more convincing than one invented yesterday. So before we can understand the Bashmu in its mature form, we have to keep this older landscape in mind. A world before imperial confidence, before the great capitals, before the standardized power of later kings, where serpent imagery was already coiling through religion and fear, through daily experience and divine thought. The dragon did not appear after civilization was secure. It appeared while civilization was still teaching itself what had to be feared, what had to be named, and what kinds of forces might still be waiting from the first age of the world, which is exactly where the question of form begins to matter, because once a culture has decided that one of its oldest dangers looks like a serpent, the next thing it has to decide is what kind of serpent could possibly be large enough, strange enough, and lethal enough to become the Bashmu. When people today ask what the Bashmu looked like, they're often hoping for something very tidy. They want the ancient equivalent of a museum label that says length, colour, number of horns, wings yes or no, venom level regrettable, temperament poor, and recommended safe distance very far indeed. But the old Mesopotamian texts do not work like that. They do not hand us a neat zoological profile. What they give us instead are pieces. A name, a class, a few striking features, a few alarming traits, and a sense of what sort of being this was meant to be in the imagination of those who preserved it. That is enough to build a strong picture, but it is a picture made from several angles rather than one perfectly lit portrait. The first and most basic clue is the name itself. In lexical tradition, Bashmu is glossed as a mythical or poisonous snake, and in later scholarly discussion of Mesopotamian texts, It is regularly understood as a serpent monster rather than a vague beast of unknown type. Right away, that tells us that the Bashmu begins not as a lion with scales or some random composite animal, but as a serpent creature whose defining quality is danger. Specifically the kind of danger associated with venom. That already makes the Bashmu feel different from the sort of dragon most modern people carry around in their heads. The base image here is not a flying reptile from a fantasy novel. It is a snake, and not just any snake, but one that has been lifted out of ordinary nature and given mythic scale. Some scholarly treatments connect its form to the horned viper, and iconographic discussions note that when Mesopotamian artists or scholars represented the being, they could imagine it as a horned serpent, sometimes with forelegs. In one scholarly summary of the constellation tradition, the Bashmu is described as a mythological animal shown as a horned viper with forelegs when representing the celestial snake, the constellation later equated with Hydra. Other summaries of the Mesopotamian creature likewise describe it as a horned snake, sometimes with 2 forelegs and in some reconstructions wings as well. The important thing here is not that every text agrees down to the last claw. The important thing is that the Bashmu was not imagined as just a bigger garden snake. It had already crossed into that unsettling territory, where a familiar animal is exaggerated into something sacred, unnatural, and much harder to dismiss. Horns push it beyond ordinary serpent life. Forelegs push it toward dragon form. The result is something close enough to a snake to feel ancient and instinctive, but strange enough to belong to the realm of gods and monsters. And that in-between quality is one of the most revealing things about the Bashmu. It is serpent first, but not only serpent. When the ancient world added horns to a creature, it was almost never doing that because it thought ordinary biology had simply not been adventurous enough. Horns in Mesopotamian imagery carried weight. They signalled force, rank, danger, and the world of beings that did not belong to the daily human level. So a horned serpent is already telling you something before it has even moved. It is not merely an animal, it is marked. It has stepped into a symbolic category. Once forelegs appear, and perhaps wings in some later or related representations, the creature becomes even less natural and more declarative. It does not just crawl, it advances. It does not just exist in a field, it enters myth. That is why the Bashmu often feels less like a simple snake that became famous and more like an ancient answer to a bigger question. What would a serpent look like if it carried not only venom but authority, terror, and the old memory of cosmic danger? The body, then, is scaled in the broad reptilian sense, even when the texts are not overly interested in describing every surface detail. Ancient Mesopotamian literature often assumes the audience understands the force of the creature without needing a patient paragraph on texture. A serpent body already comes with a package of associations. It moves low, it coils, it strikes, it disappears into hidden places. It is hard to predict, and hard to stop once it has decided your afternoon is going to be memorable for the wrong reasons. When that body's enlarged into a mythical being, it stops being merely animal and starts becoming structural. It becomes the right body for something old, something hard to grasp, and something connected to the dangerous edge between order and disorder. This is why even the simpler descriptions of the Bashmu still carry so much force. The scribes did not always need to tell you how every scale reflected the light. They only had to name the creature and place it in the right company, and the audience would already know that they were dealing with a serpent being built to represent threat at a higher level than ordinary life. Venom, though, is where the Bashmu becomes especially sharp in the mind. A horned snake is striking enough. A venomous horned snake is something else entirely. Venom is not just a physical trait. Symbolically, it is one of the most effective ways to imagine harm. A claw tears from the outside. Venom enters and works from within. It is invisible once delivered. It spreads. It transforms the body after the wound itself may seem small. That makes it perfect mythic material. In the creation epic Enuma Elish, when Tiamat arms her monstrous host, the description emphasises deadly teeth, merciless fangs, and bodies filled with poison instead of blood, and the Bashmu is listed among the terrifying beings she sets in motion. The point is not that the text pauses to offer a comfortable anatomical lecture on exactly how the Bashmu metabolized its toxins. The point is that poison is part of the creature's identity. It belongs to a class of beings defined by lethality, by the ability to injure in a way that is both sudden and dreadful, and by an inner corruption that makes them more than simple predators. The Bashmu is not dangerous because it is large alone. It is dangerous because what it carries inside is deadly. This is also where the old texts start to become delightfully excessive, because Mesopotamian monster traditions were not shy about escalation. Once a being had moved into the mythic register, there was no rule saying it had to remain reasonably proportioned for the sake of future illustrators. One tradition makes the Bashmu sea-born, and gives it a colossal size, 60 double miles in length, which is the kind of measurement that tells you the text is no longer asking to be visualized as wildlife. At that scale, the creature is no longer simply a dangerous serpent. It is a statement. It is the sort of being that belongs to the edges of the world, to primal waters, to divine conflict, and to stories in which the gods themselves have to get involved because ordinary pest control has ceased to be an option. The same tradition says it devoured fish, birds, wild asses, and human beings, which is an elegant way of saying that once this creature exists, nothing in the normal chain of life feels secure around it. It is not just a snake with a bite. It is appetite without proportion. And then there are the stranger details, the ones that remind you that old mythic creatures do not always sit still long enough to be drawn once and for all. In some traditions and scholarly discussions of incantation material, the Bashmu becomes more monstrous still, described with multiple mouths or heads and 7 tongues. One modern scholarly summary of the relevant material describes it as a monstrosity with 2 heads, 7 tongues, and additional frightening features centered on the neck, while other summaries preserve the older note that it had 6 mouths and 7 tongues. Rather than seeing this as a contradiction that ruins everything, it is better to see it as exactly what old mythic transmission often does. The creature expands, its threat multiplies. A single deadly head is no longer enough. The being becomes excessive by design. More mouths means more devouring. More tongues means more hiss, more speech like menace, more unnatural bodily abundance. The old Mesopotamian imagination was perfectly capable of making a monster worse if the symbolic job required it. The Bashmu did not need to remain biologically coherent. It needed to remain impressive. That tendency toward expansion is one reason the Bashmu feels so old. Truly ancient monsters are rarely elegant in the modern sense. They are accumulative. Horns are added because the serpent must be more than a serpent. Forelegs are added because the body must do more than slither. Wings may appear in some iconographic traditions because even the ground is not enough to contain its category of being. Mouths multiply because one set of fangs no longer expresses the scale of menace required. The result is not a refined fantasy design intended for merchandising. It is a layered creature built over time by fear, ritual, memory, and poetic exaggeration. That is why reading the descriptions can feel a little like listening to a story that has passed through many hands, each adding just enough danger to keep the creature from becoming ordinary. Ancient cultures were not trying to settle the definitive canon model for the Bashmu. They were preserving a being whose power depended on resisting simplification. There is also something worth noticing in the contrast between the Bashmu's body and the bodies of many later dragons. A great number of later dragon traditions aim upward. They fly, tower, perch, dominate the air and fill the horizon. The Bashmu, even when it acquires forelegs or wings in some representations, never quite loses that older serpent logic. It remains a creature of length, coil, rush, venom, and close attack. Even when the tradition enlarges it into sea monster scale, or gives it extra monstrous features, the underlying feel remains serpentine. That matters because the serpent is one of the oldest shapes of fear in human culture. A lion can terrify, but a serpent unsettles in a different way. It comes from below, from beside, from behind the stone, from the crack, from the reeds, from the place the eye was not watching carefully enough. The Bashmu keeps that older nervous energy. It may grow into a dragon, but it does not forget how to be a snake. The old text also suggests that the Bashmu could live comfortably in more than one register at once. It appears as a monster among monsters, but it also becomes a figure in astral thought, where Bashmu names the celestial snake identified with Hydra. That is a very Mesopotamian move. A dangerous being on Earth, in myth or in ritual, can also become part of the sky's ordered language. Once that happens, the creature gains another kind of permanence. It is no longer just a story told in a temple or an incantation spoken against danger. It is also a pattern overhead, something that can be pointed to, tracked, named, and folded into learned knowledge. This does not make the Bashmu gentler. If anything, it makes it larger in cultural memory. A serpent beast that exists in myth is significant. A serpent beast whose name also reaches the heavens is harder to forget. So if we try to gather the pieces together without forcing them into a false neatness, the old textual Bashmu looks something like this. It is a venomous or poisonous serpent monster, often imagined as horned, sometimes understood in iconography as having forelegs, and in some traditions even wings. It is not simply a snake from nature, but a mythic enlargement of serpent danger into a creature fit for divine conflict and cosmic disorder. It is associated with poison, deadly bite, and monstrous appetite. In some descriptions it becomes immense, sea-born, and large enough to belong to the deep past rather than the ordinary world. In others it becomes bodily excessive, with multiple mouths or heads and 7 tongues, as though the old imagination refused to let the threat stay modest. It can be terrestrial, marine, monstrous, and celestial all at once. In other words, it looks exactly like the kind of being an ancient civilization would create if it wanted the serpent form to carry not one fear, but several. And perhaps the most important thing of all is this. The Bashmu was described in ways that made it feel impossible to domesticate. That may be the true purpose of all these details. Horns say it is marked off from common life. Scales and serpent forms say it belongs to a very old category of fear. Venom says it kills from within. Multiple mouths or tongues say it exceeds ordinary biology, because ordinary biology is not enough for what it represents. Colossal length says it belongs to the scale of myth, not pasture or field. Every feature pushes in the same direction. The Bashmu is meant to feel like a thing that civilization can name but not make familiar. It can be written down, listed, fought by gods, represented in learned tradition, and even fixed among the stars, but it never becomes comfortable. It remains what the old world needed it to remain. A serpent turned into a statement about power, threat, and the kind of dangerous life that existed before humans convinced themselves the world was arranged for their convenience, which is exactly why the next question matters so much. Because once a creature has been given a body like that, the natural thing to ask is whether it was born as an enemy of the gods, or whether it stood closer to them than anyone sleeping safely behind city walls would have preferred. One of the most enjoyable things about ancient monsters is that they are almost never polite enough to come with a single clear origin story. Modern people tend to want a neat answer. Was the Bashmu born from chaos, yes or no? Did it begin as an enemy of the gods, yes or no? Was it later turned into a servant symbol or sacred beast, yes or no? But Mesopotamian tradition is not a multiple-choice test. It is more like a very old room full of clay tablets, fragments, lexical lists, incantations, myths, and theological habits that do not always stop to explain themselves in the order we would prefer. So when we ask where the Bashmu came from, The most honest answer is that it seems to come from two closely connected places at once. On one side, it clearly belongs to the world of chaos serpents and monstrous beings that threaten divine order. On the other, it also moves near the gods, near divine symbols, near snake-associated deities, and even into the role of a divine attendant. That is not a contradiction to ancient Mesopotamians. That is exactly how power often works in myth. If we begin with the simplest and most dramatic answer, then yes, the Bashmu can absolutely be called a child of chaos. In the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, Bashmu is one of the monsters associated with Tiamat's side of the cosmic conflict. A scholarly study of the term describes it very directly as a mythical creature aligned with the forces of chaos, noting that in Enuma Elish, the Bashmu appears among the monsters spawned by Tiamat. The same study also points to the old literary fragment often called the Bashmu myth, where the creature is described as a chaos serpent of immense size that consumes living beings until the gods intervene. That is not the profile of a quiet temple mascot. That is a being tied to the oldest and roughest layer of cosmic threat, the kind of creature that exists to show what the world looks like before order is secured or when order begins to fail. And Tiamat matters here more than almost any other figure, because once a creature is placed among her brood, it enters one of the great mythic zones of Mesopotamian imagination. Tiamat is not simply an angry mother with unfortunate children. In the creation epic, she represents the sea and the unruly, dangerous side of beginnings, the side of existence that has not yet been subdued into a usable cosmos. Her army of monsters is not there for decoration. It is there to make a point. Order does not emerge from a calm committee meeting. It has to confront beings that embody primal force, beings that are sharpened, enlarged, venomous, and structurally opposed to the world of stable kingship and settled divine rule. When the Bashmu appears in that company, it inherits all of that energy. It becomes one of those beings that seem less like animals and more like the universe's earlier, more dangerous draft. There is also a wonderfully telling line in the older material that says the Bashmu was formed in the ocean. That phrase does a tremendous amount of work. It tells you immediately that we are not dealing with a creature whose origins belong to barns, fields, courtyards, or the ordinary natural world. The ocean, in Mesopotamian mythic language, is not just a body of water. It is one of the places from which primordial danger can emerge. To say the Bashmu was formed, there is to place it in a setting older than cities and more unstable than the human world. The same scholarly discussion that treats it as a chaos serpent notes this sea connection explicitly, preserving the line that in the ocean the Bashmu serpent was formed. That origin fits the creature almost too well. A venomous, horned, monstrous serpent should not feel like something bred in a nice orderly corner of creation. It should feel like something that rises from depth, from the old waters, from a place where categories are still loose and the gods have not yet finished arranging reality. But this is where the neat modern answer begins to slip away, because the Bashmu does not remain locked on the side of cosmic rebellion. The same study that emphasizes its chaos alignment also notes something very important. Bashmu is not only the name of a monster, it can also function as the name of a divine figure. More specifically, in the lexical tradition and equals Ainum, Bashmu appears as the Sukal, the attendant or minister, of the god Tishbak. That is an extraordinary shift if one is expecting a strict moral geography in which a monster stays a monster and a god stays a god, and no one crosses the hallway. Ancient Mesopotamia was far more flexible than that. A serpentine power that begins in chaos can become attached to divine rule. A fearsome being can stand not only as an enemy, but as part of a god's court. A dangerous creature can be adopted into the vocabulary of power once it has been subordinated, named, or ritually understood. That role beside Tishbak is especially revealing. Tishbak himself was a god closely associated with snakes and serpent monsters in the Diyala region, and traditions surrounding him preserve precisely the sort of overlap we need here. He is a divine warrior, but he also belongs to a broader snake-inflected religious environment. So if Bashmu can stand as his attendant, that tells us that the line between chaos creature and divine servant was not a wall. It was more like a frontier, crossable, negotiable, dangerous certainly, but not closed. The ancient world often imagined the gods not as beings who avoided monsters altogether, but as beings who fought them, rode them, kept them, employed them, or absorbed their symbolism into their own authority. The frightening thing becomes the impressive thing once a god outranks it. This becomes even more convincing when we step back and look at the older snake-associated gods of Mesopotamia. The ORACC entry on Ninazu notes that in Ur 3 and Old Babylonian incantations he is called King of the Snakes, which is a title so direct it almost feels like ancient religion briefly decided to save us all some interpretive effort. His son Ningish-Zida is described by ORACC as a chthonic deity associated with vegetation, growth and decay, snakes and demons. That background matters because it shows that serpentine and underworld-linked power was not automatically expelled from the divine world. Quite the opposite. Some gods were deeply at home in it. They governed it, embodied it, or stood close enough to it that serpent creatures and snake symbolism became part of their identity. In a world like that, the Bashmu does not have to choose one permanent job title. It can belong to the old dangerous order and still find a place near the gods, and that, I think, is the real answer to the question. The Bashmu comes from the borderland where chaos and divinity meet, not because Mesopotamians were confused, but because they understood something modern systems sometimes struggle with. Dangerous power is still power. What threatens the world can also be what the gods master, wield, or keep near them as a sign of rank. A serpent born in the deep can remain a memory of chaos, even after it has entered divine service. In fact, that may be exactly why a god would want such a being nearby. There is no better way to advertise control than to stand beside what once terrified everyone else. It also helps to remember that ancient mythic names do not always point to a single individual creature in the way modern fantasy often does. Sometimes a name is closer to a type, a category, or a family of beings. The scholarly material on Bashmu repeatedly shows it functioning in multiple settings, in creation myth, in incantation, in lexical tradition, in cosmic geography, and in learned comparison. That suggests we may not always be dealing with one singular dragon with a perfectly trackable biography from birth to employment record. We may be dealing with a mythic serpent category that different texts apply in different ways. In one context, the Bashmu is a chaos serpent born from Tiamat's side of the world. In another, it is a monstrous model used in incantations to amplify the danger of a harmful snake. In another, it becomes a divine or semi-divine figure tied to a god's retinue. The name holds across these settings because the core idea remains the same: fearsome serpent power. What changes is the role. That is why the phrase child of chaos or servant of the gods is probably too narrow if we take it as an either-or choice. Ancient Mesopotamian thought very often preferred both and. The Bashmu can be chaos-born in symbolic terms and still be absorbed into divine structure later. It can be an enemy in one myth and an emblem in another. It can represent what the gods must conquer, and also what a god keeps close once conquered. This is not unique to the Bashmu. Myth across the ancient Near East is full of dangerous beings that move from opposition to subordination. Once the storm god defeats the dragon's force does not vanish from imagination. It becomes available. It can be turned into a standard of victory, a divine symbol, or proof that the ruling deity has mastered the worst thing there was. There is a very practical logic behind that. Human beings do this constantly with fear. At first, something is dreadful because it threatens us. Later, if we believe it has been contained, it becomes impressive because someone stronger controls it. A lion in the wild is dangerous. A lion beneath a king's feet in art means the king is more dangerous still. The same logic applies to serpents and dragons. A chaos serpent loose in the deep is a problem. A chaos serpent attached to a god is propaganda. It tells worshippers that the deity does not merely keep order with gentle speeches and good intentions. He commands the old dangerous things too. That may be especially relevant in Mesopotamia, where divine power was never imagined as entirely mild or domestic. The gods gave kingship, crops, justice, and protection. Yes, but they also controlled plague, storm, war, flood, and fate. A strong god was not strong because he had never gone near danger. He was strong because danger answered to him, or because he had defeated it and remade the world afterward. So when the Bashmu stands near divine figures, it does not lose its threatening nature. That threatening nature becomes useful. The serpent's fearfulness is precisely what makes it a good divine associate. Nobody is impressed if the god's attendant is essentially a very polite goat. There is also something deeper going on with the sea origin and the snake god associations taken together. The ocean in Mesopotamian myth points downward and backward, toward first things, toward what predates the present arrangement of the cosmos. Snake gods like Ninazu and Ingisida point downward too, into underworld, earth, vegetation, decay, hidden life, and the powers beneath the visible surface. So even when the Bashmu moves from chaos monster to divine servant, it does not really leave its native terrain. It still belongs to the deep, the old, the below, the dangerous. It is simply now standing in a more organised relationship to those forces. Ancient religion often works exactly like that. What is older than order is not erased by order. It is incorporated, subordinated, named, ritualised, and given a place. And I suspect that is why the Bashmu feels so persuasive as a creature. It does not come from one clean origin, because it was never meant to represent one clean idea. It is part serpent, part dragon, part poison, part primordial threat, part divine instrument, part memory of the deep world beneath the human one. Call it a child of chaos, and you are right, because the old texts place it among the beings of Tiamat and describe it as a chaos serpent. Call it a servant of the gods, and you are also right, because the lexical and theological traditions can seat it in a god's retinue and place it close to snake-centered divine power. The point is not to flatten those two identities into one safe summary. The point is to let them stay together long enough to understand what the ancient imagination was doing. It was saying, in effect, that the most dangerous things do not always remain outside the walls forever. Sometimes they are the walls, sometimes they are the standards planted on the walls, sometimes they become the weapons of the king, the emblem of the god, the creature at the threshold, the force that once threatened the universe and now proves who rules it. The Bashmu comes from that exact logic. It is born where the waters are oldest and the world is least settled, and yet it can end up beside divine authority without losing the taste of those old waters. It still remembers what it is. That is why it remains impressive. A serpent that was always tame is not very interesting. A serpent that had to be brought into order, or perhaps never fully was, is another matter. So if we want the most faithful answer the tablets allow, it may be this. The Bashmu comes from the side of reality that Mesopotamians regarded as ancient, dangerous, and prior to ordinary human order, in mythic combat that makes it a child of chaos, in divine service that makes it the kind of being a god can claim once he has mastered chaos. Those are not rival biographies. They are two phases of the same old pattern, which is why the next step in the story is so important, because once a serpent of that kind enters the world of Tiamat and the gods, sooner or later it is going to find itself in the middle of a much larger war. By the time the Bashmu enters the story of Tiamat's brood, it is no longer just an old serpent from the edges of early Mesopotamian fear. It has stepped onto the largest stage the Babylonian imagination could give it. This is where the creature stops being only a dangerous being and becomes part of a war about the structure of the universe itself. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Tiamat raises an army of monsters. Marduk defeats her, and that victory establishes his supremacy among the gods and helps explain how order emerged from a world of threat and instability. The Bashmu appears in that setting as one of the monsters associated with Tiamat's side, which means it belongs not just to local fear now, but to cosmic conflict. What makes this especially interesting is that Tiamat is not introduced as some cartoon villain from the first line. In Mesopotamian tradition, she begins as a primordial being, one of the oldest divine realities in existence, and in the creation story she initially does not support Apsu's plan to destroy the younger gods. Only later, after Apsu has been killed, and after the lower gods push her toward revenge, does she become the main antagonist and assemble her monstrous host under Chingu. That matters because the war in Enuma Elish is not simply good gods against bad monsters in the modern storybook sense. It is a struggle over succession, authority, and the terrifying problem of what happens when the oldest forces in existence turn openly against the younger order. That is the moment when dragons begin to matter in a very particular way. When Tiamat decides to fight, she does not rely on speeches, diplomacy, or the sort of committee process that usually ends with everyone exhausted and nothing solved. She creates a war host. The text describes her gathering monsters and placing Chingu at their head, giving him extraordinary authority as leader of the rebellion. In the account preserved in translation, she collects an army of dragons and monsters, raises Chingu to command, and gives him special power, while later summaries of the poem note that she created 11 monstrous beings fit for war. This is not background decoration. The monsters are part of the machinery of cosmic crisis. They are how chaos becomes active, and somewhere inside that war host is the Bashmu. A scholarly treatment of the creature states directly that in Enuma Elish the Bashmu is one of the monsters spawned by Tiamat. That one point is enough to change how we see it. The Bashmu is not merely a dragon that happens to exist in the same universe as the Great Battle. It belongs to the side of primordial revolt. It is one of the forms that chaos takes when chaos decides it needs teeth, venom, and enough presence to terrify gods. This is why the Bashmu feels larger in this part of the tradition than it does in a simple lexical gloss. Once it enters Tiamat's brood, it stops being only a serpent monster and becomes part of the prehistory of the ordered world. The text is wonderfully direct about the sort of creatures Tiamat makes. In a widely used scholarly translation, she gives birth to giant serpents, sharp of tooth and merciless, fills their bodies with poison instead of blood, clothes the monsters with dread, and loads them with an aura that makes them godlike. The same passage goes on to list the Hydra, the dragon, the hairy hero, the great demon, the savage dog, the scorpion man, fierce demons, the fish man, and the mighty bull among her creations. That set of details tells us exactly what kind of war this is. These are not troops in armour. They are embodiments of terror, beings exaggerated past nature and charged with supernatural force. A Bashmu in this setting is not just poisonous. It is part of an army built to make resistance feel hopeless. There is a detail in that passage that deserves a little extra attention, because it explains a great deal about ancient monsters in general. Tiamat does not merely create dangerous things, she makes them awe-inspiring. The translation says she loaded them with an aura, and made them godlike. That means the monsters are not only physically threatening, they are terrifying in status. They bear a kind of splendour that overwhelms the onlooker. Mesopotamian thought often treated terrible radiance, divine terror, and visible authority as closely connected. So the dragon in the cosmic war is not just larger than life, it is charged with a presence that belongs near divinity itself. That is one reason the Bashmu and creatures like it do not feel like wildlife scaled upward. They feel like power given a body. This also helps explain why serpents and dragons are such efficient forms for Tiamat's side of the story. A serpent already carries the logic of sudden danger. It moves low, strikes quickly, hides well, and in venomous forms kills from within. Once you enlarge that into a monster of primordial war, you get a creature that feels older than civilization and less negotiable than any human enemy. A soldier can surrender. A king can be bribed. A dragon filled with poison instead of blood is not here for compromise. It is here to embody the fear that the old deep world might return and wipe out the younger arrangement altogether. The Bashmu works perfectly in Tiamat's brood because it already belongs to that language of ancient concentrated threat. This is the point where Marduk enters the story in the way later Babylonians wanted him remembered. Not simply as one god among others, but as the god willing to face what the rest cannot handle. The surviving translation makes the sequence clear. I cannot deal with Tiamat's host, so Marduk is called upon. He agrees to fight, but only on the condition that he will rule the gods after victory. The gods accept, robe him, arm him, and send him out. In other words, the cosmic war is not only about survival, it is also about kingship. Marduk's right to rule is proven through combat with primordial chaos and its monsters. The Bashmu is therefore part of the theatre in which divine sovereignty is established, and the battle itself is exactly the kind of ancient scene that knows how to make a storm god look convincing. Marduk goes out armed with bow, arrows, club, lightning, and the winds. The translation preserved in the PDF summary says he attacks with thunder and storms before him, traps Tiamat in his nets, and when she opens her mouth to devour him, he fills it with the evil wind so she cannot close it, then shoots an arrow that splits her heart. It is a fight staged on the level of elements, not merely muscles. Wind, net, storm, and weapon all work together. This matters for the Bashmu and the other monsters, because they belong to the same defeated order. When Marduk wins over Tiamat, he also wins over the entire monstrous structure that made her army formidable. That is one of the quiet but important features of the story. The monsters are not just there to make the battle scene more exciting, though they certainly help. They function as evidence of how serious the threat is. If Tiamat had risen with one bad-tempered snake and an unhelpful expression, the poem would not have achieved what it needed to achieve. Marduk's triumph must be large enough to justify universal kingship. So Tiamat gets a host. She gets dragons, scorpion men, monstrous hybrids, poison-filled bodies, fearsome aura, and Chingu armed with the Tablet of Destinies. Only then does Marduk's victory mean what Babylon wants it to mean. He did not defeat a nuisance. He defeated the kind of primordial war machine that only the supreme god could defeat. Once Tiamat falls, the story moves with startling speed from combat to creation. Marduk splits her body and uses it to make the ordered cosmos. In the translation summary, half becomes the heavens, guards a station so her waters do not escape, the stars are assigned their places, and the other half becomes the land, with the Tigris and Euphrates flowing from her eyes. This is one of the reasons the war is truly cosmic rather than merely mythic spectacle. The battle is not something that happens after the world is already settled. It is part of how the settled world comes into being. Defeating Tiamat and her brood is what allows structure, place, and regularity to exist. The Bashmu, then, belongs to the defeated side of pre-order reality. It is one of the shapes the world had to overcome before it could become habitable. But Mesopotamian myth is too interesting to stop at simple defeat. One of the most memorable after effects of the story is that Marduk does not merely scatter Tiamat's monsters and move on. A university-hosted summary of Enuma Elish says that he turns her 11 monsters into statues and places them at the gate of the Apsu. That is an astonishing image when you stop and think about it. The monsters are not erased, they are monumentalized. Defeated chaos becomes a visible reminder of victory. The dragon is no longer loose in war, but neither is it forgotten. It is fixed as a trophy, a warning, and a sign that cosmic order was established by overcoming beings exactly like these. That detail tells us something profound about how Mesopotamian culture treated monsters. It did not always destroy them conceptually once they were defeated. It repurposed them. It made them part of the architecture of memory. A creature like the Bashmu could begin as a terror in Tiamat's warhost, yet remain culturally valuable afterward precisely because it represented conquered danger. This is very close to how later royal and divine symbolism often works. The dangerous beast becomes the proof of authority once authority has mastered it. The dragon no longer threatens the world directly, but it stays in the story, in the image, and in the symbolic order as a sign of what had to be brought under control. And that is why Tiamat's brood matters so much for understanding the Bashmu. Without this war, the Bashmu might remain only a serpent monster from old lists and specialized traditions. With this war, it becomes part of the central Babylonian explanation for why the universe is ordered and why Marduk rules. It stands among the creatures of the losing side, yes, but the losing side here is not minor. It is primordial. It is old enough to challenge the younger gods themselves. So the Bashmu gains stature simply by belonging to that company. It becomes one of the dragon forms through which Mesopotamia imagined the deep resistance of chaos to divine order. There is also a psychological truth hiding in the middle of all this. Human beings often imagine their greatest fears not as isolated threats, but as organized ones. A single snake is frightening. A brood of poison-filled serpent monsters serving a primordial sea power is something else entirely. It suggests that danger is coordinated, that chaos has a command structure, that the universe can tilt toward hostility on purpose. Ancient myth is very good at taking such fears seriously. Enuma Elish does not tell us that disorder is random. It tells us disorder can marshal forces, appoint leaders, carry symbols of legitimacy, and come at the gods in battle formation. The Bashmu belongs to that military imagination of chaos, which is exactly why it remains such an effective dragon. At the same time, the Bashmu's presence in Tiamat's army does not trap it forever in one simple role. Ancient Mesopotamian tradition, as we have already seen, is perfectly capable of taking a creature from the side of primal threat and later bringing it into divine orbit in other ways. So when the Bashmu appears in the Great Cosmic War, we are not seeing the end of its meaning. We are seeing one of its most dramatic deployments. Here it is a dragon of revolt, a body of venom and terror on the side of the old waters. But once a creature like that has been defeated, remembered, monumentalized and preserved in learned tradition, it is already halfway toward becoming something more complicated than a defeated enemy, which is where the story naturally goes next. Because once the war is over and Marduk's order stands, the question is no longer only what the Bashmu fought for, but what place a dragon like that can still hold in the world of gods. If there is one thing the ancient Mesopotamian world was not especially interested in, it was tidy categories. Modern people like their labels clean. Monster on one shelf, holy symbol on another, divine servant in a separate cabinet with good lighting, and a little plaque explaining the job description. But the world of the great Mesopotamian gods was not arranged like that. A being could begin as a terror, later appear in a god's service, and still remain frightening enough that no sensible person would volunteer to babysit it. That is exactly the difficulty and the fascination of the Bashmu. In lexical texts it is identified as a mythical poisonous snake, and in the older mythic tradition it can appear on the side of cosmic chaos. Yet another line of tradition places Bashmu in the divine sphere itself, identifying it in the lexical series and equals Anum as the Sukal, or attendant of Tishbak. So the Bashmu is not easy to flatten into one role. It is a monster, yes, but also the kind of monster that can be brought close to divine power without losing its teeth, which is a very Mesopotamian thing to do with a dangerous creature. That tells us something important right away. In the world of the Anunnaki, or more broadly the Mesopotamian divine order that later imagination gathers under that name, danger was not always pushed outside the sacred. Sometimes it was folded into it. a fearsome serpent was not automatically banished to a permanent exile beyond the map. It could become part of the divine court, part of a god's symbolism, part of the architecture of power itself. If that sounds a little unsettling, that is because ancient religion often preferred strength to comfort. The gods were not there to make the universe feel cozy. They were there to rule it. And rule, in Mesopotamian thought, often meant command over precisely those forces that humans feared most. A god who stood above a serpent dragon, rode one, or kept one near him, did not look reckless. He looked legitimate. He looked like someone who had power over the old dangerous things. So when the Bashmu appears near the gods, it is not being softened. It is being used to say something about divine control. This is where the Bashmu's role as a monster remains essential, because it never stops being a dangerous being in origin. The same scholarly discussion that notes its place beside Tishbak also connects it with the chaos serpent tradition and preserves the line that in the ocean the Bashmu serpent was formed, a phrase that places it in the same deep and unstable mythic geography from which other primordial threats emerge. In the Enuma Elish, Bashmu belongs among the monstrous forces associated with Tiamat's side of the great conflict. So the creature begins, at least in one powerful strand of tradition, not as a pet or a ceremonial ornament, but as something formed in the deep tied to the sea, poison, and the sort of threat that has to be met by gods rather than shepherds with sticks. That background never really disappears. Even when the Bashmu moves into divine orbit, it carries with it the memory of what it once was. And that memory is useful. A god is more impressive when the creature at his side is known to have come from the wild side of creation. Tishbak is the clearest place where this transformation becomes visible. In the tradition preserved by an equals Arnhem, the Bashmu is named as his sukal, his attendant or minister. That is not a throwaway detail. In Mesopotamian theology, a sakal is not some decorative extra standing in the background wondering whether the meeting will end before sunset. The sakal is an important subordinate figure in the divine administration, an envoy, attendant or trusted presence attached to a god of rank. If Bashmu can appear in that role, then the creature has crossed a very significant line. It is no longer only a threat to sacred order, it has been drawn into sacred order. And Tishbak is exactly the sort of god beside whom that makes sense. He's associated with Eshnuna, warfare and serpentine symbolism. Later reference material also preserves that his animal symbol was probably the snake dragon. So Bashmu beside Tishbak is not a random placement. It belongs to a broader Mesopotamian habit of keeping serpent power close to certain gods, rather than pretending it had vanished from the sacred world altogether. Once you notice that pattern, other snake-linked gods begin to make the whole picture feel much less accidental. ORACC's entry on Ninazoo notes that in Ur-3 and Old Babylonian incantations he was called King of the Snakes. That title is wonderfully direct and spares us the usual interpretive gymnastics. He was not a god vaguely sympathetic to reptiles from a distance. He was a divine authority over them. ORACC's entry on Ningishzida likewise describes him as a chthonic deity associated with vegetation, growth and decay, snakes, and demons. In other words, the Mesopotamian divine world had room for gods who were intimately connected to serpent power, underworld power, and the dangerous life of what lies beneath the surface. The Bashmu, therefore, does not stand in isolation. It belongs to a much larger sacred ecosystem, in which snakes and dragon-like beings can be terrible, yes, but also deeply woven into divine identity. So when later tradition lets the Bashmu move from monster to attendant, that is not theological chaos, it is theological continuity. Ningishzida is especially revealing here, because his imagery shows how thin the line could be between sacred serpent and sacred dragon. In the Black and Green Encyclopedia, Ningishzida is described as an underworld deity whose symbol and beast was the horned snake or dragon, and he's also associated astrologically with the constellation we know as Hydra. The same reference notes horned serpents rising above his shoulders in the famous Gudea imagery. That is a useful reminder that once a serpent enters the highest levels of symbolism, it does not need to remain a humble field creature. It can rise into heraldry, constellations, seals, and divine iconography. It can become an identifying beast. It can stand not simply for danger in general, but for a specific god's reach into the hidden, underworld and primeval dimensions of reality. The Bashmu fits comfortably in that atmosphere. Sacred creature, in this sense, does not mean harmless. It means set apart, meaningful, and attached to a power bigger than ordinary life. This also helps explain why the ancient Mesopotamians were not especially troubled by letting the same basic creature type serve multiple symbolic functions. To us, there can seem to be a contradiction. If the Bashmu is a monster of chaos, how can it become a divine attendant? But from the Mesopotamian point of view, that may be asking the wrong question. The better question is who commands it now? The being itself remains fearsome. What changes is its place in the hierarchy? Once a god masters a chaos creature, its threat can be turned into prestige. Human beings still think this way, honestly. A wild storm is frightening. A king or god who can command the storm is reassuring in an intimidating sort of way. A serpent in the reeds is bad news. A serpent under divine control becomes an emblem of supernatural authority. That is why the Bashmu can function almost like a weapon. Not necessarily a weapon in the simple sense of being picked up and waved about like a very complicated spear, but as an extension of divine force. It embodies the sort of danger that a god can deploy, command, or keep in readiness. And yes, weapon is the right word so long as we keep it broad enough. Ancient gods did not only wield clubs, bows, and thunder. They also wielded beasts, plagues, storms, and terrifying attendants. A sacred creature could be part of a god's arsenal simply by existing in his orbit. The presence of the Bashmu beside a divine figure tells worshippers something about the nature of that god's power. This deity does not rule by mild suggestion. He rules with access to the old venomous things. Even when the Bashmu is not literally attacking anyone in the story in front of us, it contributes to a climate of strength. It says the god's authority reaches into places ordinary humans would rather avoid. That is one reason serpentine attendants are so effective symbolically. They do not need to do very much on screen. They radiate risk. You see the dragon, and you understand immediately that the deity beside it is not to be approached with casual confidence and a poorly prepared offering basket. There is another subtle point here, and it has to do with transfer. Mesopotamian divine beasts could move from one high god to another. Black and green note that the snake dragon was transferred among a number of high-ranking gods, including Marduk and Nabu in Babylonia and Ashur in Assyria, and that once the snake dragon became Marduk's animal, it could continue as a symbol for gods formerly associated with it, including Ningizida. That tells us the sacred beast was not always locked to one owner forever. Divine politics, theology, and empire could move symbols around. When a god rose, the beast rose with him. When a city's theology became dominant, older creatures could be absorbed into the new order. That makes the Bashmu even more interesting, because it suggests that sacred dragon imagery in Mesopotamia was not static. It was a language of power, and languages of power tend to travel. A creature that began in old serpent fear could become a royal divine marker in several different settings. So was the Bashmu a monster? Absolutely. The lexical evidence still calls it a mythical poisonous snake, and the mythic tradition still remembers it on the side of primordial threat. Was it a weapon? In effect, yes, because once such a creature enters divine service or symbolism, it becomes part of how a god projects force. And was it sacred? Very much so, though sacred in Mesopotamia does not mean gentle or morally sanitized. It means bound up with divine reality, attached to temple and text, named in learned tradition, and made to carry meanings larger than ordinary animal life could manage on its own. ancient religion often treated terrifying beings as sacred precisely because they were terrifying. Fear was not evidence that something stood outside the divine sphere. Sometimes it was evidence that one had brushed too close to it. The Bashmu keeps that uncomfortable truth alive. It is sacred not because it has become safe, but because it has become significant. And perhaps that is the best way to hold the creature in the mind as we move forward. Not as one thing, but as a being with layers. A dragon born in the deep, remembered as a chaos serpent, feared for venom and monstrous form, yet also close enough to gods like Tishpak, and conceptually close enough to the serpent world of Ninazu and Ningishzida, that it can no longer be treated as a mere enemy outside the sacred walls. It belongs both outside and inside. It is what the gods fight, what they master, what they keep near them, and what they sometimes let stand as proof that their power reaches into the oldest and darkest corners of creation. Which is why the next step in the story is not to leave the Bashmu floating in abstract theology, but to bring it down into the lived religious world, into temples, rituals, and incantations, where people had to decide what to do when a creature like this was not just part of a cosmic war long ago, but part of the dangerous sacred atmosphere surrounding them every day. By the time a creature like the Bashmu entered the religious life of Mesopotamia, it was no longer just a monster from a story people told to make the old cosmic wars sound impressive. It had become part of the atmosphere of danger that surrounded ordinary life, and that matters because ancient Mesopotamians did not keep religion in one room and fear in another. Their world did not work that way. A dangerous being could exist in myth, but it could also matter in ritual. It could belong to the deep past, but it could also become relevant at the doorway of a house, in the sick room of a child, in the whispered concerns of a family, or in the formal language spoken before a divine image in a temple. The Bashmu, like other serpent and dragon forms in Mesopotamian thought, moved through that whole structure. It was feared, named, classified, invoked, resisted, and in a certain sense managed. Not eliminated, because ancient religion was rarely so optimistic, but managed. Kept in its place as much as human beings could manage with words, offerings, divine help, and an extraordinary amount of ritual seriousness. This is one of the things that makes Mesopotamian religion feel so alive. It was not content to leave danger as an abstract idea. If something threatened life, health, fertility, order, or peace, then it had to be addressed somehow. That did not mean every fear received a neat explanation and a guaranteed solution by sunset. Ancient people were not under the illusion that the universe could be made entirely cooperative by correct paperwork. But they did believe that naming, ritual, and divine appeal mattered. They believed the unseen world had structure. They believed hostile forces could be countered, redirected, or at least limited by the right words and actions. So when a creature like the Bashmu lived in the religious imagination, it also entered the practical side of sacred life. People did not merely remember that dragons existed in the oldest myths. They treated serpent danger as something that required response. That response began with the most basic ancient tool of all, which was naming. Mesopotamian culture loved lists, and that was not a trivial habit. To modern eyes, a lexical list can seem dry, but for the ancient world, classification was a kind of power. If a being had a name, then it was not just random fear moving around in the dark. It had a place in knowledge. It could be discussed, copied, taught, and inserted into ritual language. It could be distinguished from other beings. It could become part of a tradition of expertise. That is a very important shift. The difference between unnamed terror and named terror is not that one disappears. It is that the second can be handled more deliberately. Bashmu, once named, was no longer just some enormous nightmare reptile in the edges of cultural memory. It was a known category of danger. Serious, yes. Ancient, yes. But known enough to enter the world of scribes and specialists. And Mesopotamia produced a great many specialists. Priests, lamenters, diviners, ritual experts and exorcist healers all worked in a landscape where the boundary between illness, misfortune, bad dreams, divine displeasure, impurity, and hostile unseen forces was not always drawn the way a modern person might draw it. If something went wrong, it could have multiple layers. There might be a natural cause, but there could also be a spiritual or divine dimension. There could be a broken taboo, an offended god, a malign force, a curse, an omen, or the movement of some harmful being through human space. In that setting, serpent and dragon imagery was extremely useful, because it gave shape to hidden attack. Venom was a perfect symbol for trouble that entered the body and worked from within. A serpent strike was sudden, intrusive, and difficult to reverse. Expand that logic to the mythic level, and a being like the Bashmu becomes a natural model for the sort of harm that ritual specialists needed to speak against. So imagine the atmosphere, not in the palace for a moment, but in an ordinary household or a local shrine. The day has already gone badly. Someone is ill. Livestock have died. There has been a frightening dream. A child wakes in distress. Something about the house feels wrong. In a modern setting, people might reach first for a doctor, a plumber, a neurologist, or perhaps a long internet search that mostly increases anxiety. In ancient Mesopotamia, people certainly had practical responses too, but they also turned toward ritual expertise. Words mattered. Incantations mattered. Sacred formulas mattered. The harmful thing, whatever it was, had to be addressed in speech. It had to be named, commanded, cursed, expelled, transferred, or bound. A creature like the Bashmu belonged in that world not because every problem was blamed on one literal dragon slithering through town, but because dragon language captured the form of threat itself. Something had entered where it should not. Something dangerous had come too close. Something venomous, hidden, old, or hostile needed to be forced back. Ancient incantations often work by piling names, comparisons, and commands on top of one another. They identify the danger, increase its vividness, place it under divine authority, and then push it outward. The logic is almost legal as much as magical. The harmful force is being formally recognised and then formally denied the right to remain. That style suits the Bashmu perfectly. A venomous serpent monster is exactly the kind of being one names in order to diminish its freedom, and this is one of the most interesting things about Mesopotamian religious language. It is often theatrical, but not careless. It does not chant vaguely into the air and hope for the best. It constructs a case. It appeals to gods, recalls older victories, and asserts order over disorder. If Marduk once defeated the brood of Tiamat, then the same divine authority can be invoked now against lesser manifestations of serpent danger in the human world. The ritual does not recreate the cosmic war in full, but it borrows its logic. Chaos was defeated before. It can be contained again. Temples played a central role in maintaining that logic. A Mesopotamian temple was not merely a place where people expressed private spirituality in an uplifting architectural setting. It was a house of a god, an economic institution, a centre of offerings, labour, storage and ceremony, and a point where the human city met divine order. That made it the perfect place from which hostile forces could be challenged. If the Bashmu represented old danger, venom, or serpent power outside proper human control, then the temple represented the opposite. It represented the organised presence of a deity whose authority could impose limits. Even when the god in question had serpent associations of his own, that did not weaken the temple's role. It strengthened it. A god who knew the serpent world was better equipped to rule it. This is why serpent-linked gods are so important to the story. A deity associated with underworld life, hidden power, or snake symbolism could be called upon not simply to remove every trace of serpent force from creation, but to govern it. That is a subtle but important difference. Ancient religion did not always seek annihilation. Often it sought correct boundaries. The dragon did not have to stop existing in the cosmos. It had to stop crossing into places where it did not belong. The venom did not have to disappear from creation entirely. It had to be denied access to the body, the home, the field, the king, or the temple precinct. In that sense, rituals of control were often about placement. The harmful being was told where it belonged and where it did not. It could be sent back to desert, steppe, marsh, underworld, mountain, sea, or the distant margins of the world from which dangerous things properly came. There is something almost administrative about that, and in Mesopotamia that is not an insult. This was a civilization that understood the value of proper placement. Grain belonged in one place, records in another, offerings in another, and dangerous beings ideally very far away. Ritual language often works like a divine filing system with much higher stakes. The harmful force is identified, sorted, and removed to its assigned domain. A dragon-like being that has crossed into human order becomes not just an enemy, but a violation of cosmic zoning. That may sound lightly humorous, but it captures something real. Mesopotamian religion was deeply invested in right arrangement. Gods above, dead below, kings ruling, fields producing, households ordered, rites observed, and hostile beings kept to their proper side of reality. The Bashmu, when feared in ritual life, was one more form of what happens when that arrangement is threatened. Protective objects mattered too. The ancient world did not rely only on speech, it liked things. Figurines, inscribed tablets, amulets, seals, images at thresholds, apotropaic forms placed in foundations or rooms, all of these helped make invisible order visible. A dangerous being could be countered by another image of power, by a divine symbol, by a creature placed under sacred control, or by a representation that signaled to hostile forces that this place was guarded. That gives dragons and serpent beasts a curious second life. The same sort of creature that appears in chaos or danger can also become part of the visual vocabulary that protects. Once a being has been mastered by a god, its image can work on the side of the order. The old terror becomes a warning to other terrors. Mesopotamian culture was very good at this reversal. What once threatened the boundary could later be stationed at the boundary in service of divine authority. Thresholds were especially important because thresholds are where anxiety lives. A door is both protection and vulnerability. It keeps the household intact, but it is also the point where outside becomes inside. Ancient people everywhere understood that doors, gates, windows, and corners feel symbolically charged, and Mesopotamia was no exception. The dragon in ritual imagination is very effective at thresholds because the dragon itself belongs to the idea of crossing. It comes from the outside in. It intrudes. It violates proper space. So naturally the response involved guarding entrances, speaking protective words over boundaries, and invoking gods whose authority extended into the liminal places where hostile beings might attempt entry. If the Bashmu was feared as the sort of creature that could pass from myth into symbolic threat, then the doorway was one of the places where that fear had to be answered. Incantations themselves often feel almost physical in that context. They do not merely describe, they act. They spit the danger out through language. They call on divine names, repeat formulas, condemn, compare, expel, and purify. A serpent or dragon being named in such language becomes smaller in one very important sense. It becomes answerable. Not harmless, not imaginary, but answerable. The ritual specialist is no longer facing a vague catastrophe. He is facing a defined adversary whose place in the cosmic order can be argued against. Ancient people did not need modern psychology to understand that this was powerful. Fear becomes more manageable when given a body and a script. The Bashmu in an incantation is terrible, but it is also trapped in words. That is already a form of control, and that control was never entirely human. Mesopotamian incantations lean heavily on divine precedent. The gods have done this before. The gods defeated serpent powers, established order, built boundaries, assigned domains, and crushed rebellion. Human ritual draws strength from that older story. In this sense, every temple rite against a harmful force echoes the great cosmic war without needing to retell it from the beginning. The logic is simple. The gods ordered the universe once, and their authority still stands. Therefore, the harmful thing, whether imagined as demon, curse, poison, or dragon-like intrusion, can be sent back under that authority. The Bashmu may belong to ancient terror, but ancient terror has a superior on the divine chain of command. There is also a social dimension worth noticing. Ritual control of dangerous beings helps stabilize community life. If misfortune had no framework, then panic could spread very easily. But if there were known rites, known specialists, known gods to appeal to, and known texts to use, then fear had a pathway. People could do something. Even if the result was uncertain, action itself mattered. Offerings could be made, purification could be performed, words could be spoken, a house could be marked as protected, a patient could be ritually treated, a temple could stage the presence of divine order in public form. That does not mean Mesopotamians felt permanently safe. They clearly did not. But it means they were not passive. The Bashmu in this lived religious world was not just an idea people endured. It was part of a problem they approached with methods, and those methods reveal something very human. People rarely believe they can make danger vanish forever. What they want, more often, is enough order to sleep, enough control to get through the season, enough divine favour to protect the child, the flock, the field, the king, the home. Mesopotamian religion offered that kind of serious realism. It did not promise a dragon-free universe. It promised tools for surviving in a universe where dragons, in one form or another, belong to the structure of things. That may actually be why its rituals feel so convincing across time. They are not naive. They assume danger is real, recurring, and older than the individual person facing it. They simply refuse to leave the person defenseless. So when we imagine the Bashmu in temples and incantations, we should not picture one simple scene. We should picture a whole system, a priest before a divine image, a ritual specialist reciting formulas from memory or tablet, a household seeking protection at night, a threshold marked against intrusion, a figurine buried for defense, a serpent god invoked not because snakes are friendly, but because only a god who understands the old dangerous things can command them properly. We should picture the dragon not only in mythic battle, but in the tense religious space where ancient people tried to keep cosmic disorder from becoming tomorrow's household disaster. That, I think, is the best way to understand how Mesopotamians feared and controlled the dragon. They feared it intelligently. They did not reduce it to folklore or dismiss it as atmospheric decoration. They treated it as part of a serious grammar of threat. And they controlled it in the only way ancient religion could truly control anything, by binding it to names, placing it under divine authority, defending boundaries, and repeating the order of the cosmos in ritual form until the dangerous thing was no longer free to move wherever it pleased. The Bashmu remained ancient, venomous, and sacred in the uncomfortable Mesopotamian sense of that word. But once it entered the temple and the incantation, it also entered a network of limits. It could be feared, yes, but it could also be answered, and once that answer existed, the Bashmu no longer stood alone. It had to be understood beside the other serpent and dragon beings that shared its world, overlapped with its form, and helped define what kind of creature it really was. Once the Bashmu enters the company of other Mesopotamian beasts, something very useful happens. It stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like part of a whole language. That language was built out of scales, horns, claws, poison, and divine politics. Ancient Mesopotamia did not just have one dragon and then call it a day. It had several serpent and dragon forms, and each of them carried a slightly different weight. Some were closer to chaos, Some were closer to kingship. Some were closer to temple symbolism. Some were closer to the old dangerous power that gods wanted near them precisely because it was dangerous. That is where the Bashmu becomes even more interesting, because the more creatures we place beside it, the more clearly its own role comes into focus. It is not just another dragon among dragons. It belongs to a family of beings, but it keeps its own personality within that family. And the family itself tells us a great deal about how Mesopotamians imagined power. They did not imagine power as clean, polite, and abstract. They imagined it as something that could hiss, coil, bite, trample, and stand at the side of a god like a living warning sign. The Black and Green Dictionary puts this beautifully in practical terms when it notes that among the beasts of the gods were the snake dragon, with a snake-like body, horns, lion's forelegs, and birds' hind legs, and that these creatures could guard shrine entrances or even serve as altars with symbols placed on their backs. In other words, these were not random monsters wandering through old stories. They were part of the architecture of sacred force. The Bashmu sits at one end of that language, close to the oldest serpent fear. The lexical tradition in ORACC glosses Bashmu as a mythical poisonous snake, and the same entry explicitly links it with Ushumgal, dragon, while also listing Ushumgalu as great dragon. That already tells us that the boundaries between these terms are not brick walls. They overlap, they echo one another, but the Bashmu still feels distinct because its core identity remains serpent first. It is poisonous, venomous, deep-born, and close to the primordial side of myth. In the scholarly discussion of the Etana material, it appears as a chaos serpent, and is linked with the line that says it was formed in the ocean, which places it firmly in the old deep world rather than in the polished symbolism of later imperial art. The Bashmu is the kind of dragon that still remembers water, poison, and the dangerous age before the cosmos was arranged properly. When it appears among Tiamat's creatures, that fit is exact. It belongs to the side of the world that resists order. So if you imagine the Bashmu standing beside the other beasts, it is the one that feels most like a survival from the first rough draft of creation. It is less courtly than some of the others, less standardized in form, and more tightly bound to the idea of serpentine threat itself. The Mushushu, by contrast, feels as though the dragon has been brought into the city and taught how to serve power without becoming tame. This is one of the most recognizable creatures in Mesopotamian art precisely because it becomes visually stable in a way the Bashmu does not always. The Black and Green Dictionary describes the snake dragon as having a snake-like body, horns, lion's forelegs, and bird's hind legs, and the Metropolitan Museum describes the Mushushu as a composite dragon associated with Marduk and Nabu. ORACC's entry on Marduk says plainly that the animal which often represents him is the Mushushu, the snake dragon, and the British Museum preserves late Babylonian plaques showing that same creature in relief. This is the dragon that steps out of the oldest serpent fear and into heraldry, cult image, and state religion. It is still dangerous, of course. It would be very un-Mesopotamian for a sacred beast to become cuddly, merely because it had entered official service. But the Mushushu feels more formalized. It is the dragon as divine emblem, as sacred beast, as the creature that can stride across glazed brick on the Ishtar Gate and tell everyone entering Babylon exactly whose city this is and whose god outranks the rest. That is a very different social life from the Bashmus. The Bashmu is older in mood. The Mushushu is more public. That public quality matters enormously. The Mushushu is not just a monster remembered in texts. It becomes one of the great visual carriers of divine legitimacy. On the Ishtar Gate and related material, the creature is no longer only something that had to be defeated in myth. It is now a sign that divine authority is already won and is comfortable enough to decorate the capital with its former terror. Even Black and Green note that the snake dragon was transferred among different high-ranking gods, including Marduk and Nabu in Babylonia and Ashur in Assyria, and that Marduk and Nabu could be represented with it in art. Their entry on Marduk adds that the snake dragon as the animal of Marduk and Nabu was taken over from Tishbak, likely after Hammurabi's conquest of Eshnunna, while their entry on Tishbak says his animal symbol was probably the snake dragon. So the Mushushu is not just an image. It is a portable piece of divine prestige. It can move with theology, empire and cult transfer. Once a city rises, its dragon can rise with it. Once a god becomes supreme, his beast can become more visible. That gives the Mushushu a different sort of power from the Bashmu. The Bashmu belongs to deep mythic fear. The Mushushu belongs to fear made official, fear brought into architecture, fear reorganized into state-backed holiness. And then there is Ushumgalu, which may be the most revealing comparison of all, because it shows that in Mesopotamia, a dragon could become not only a beast, but a title. ORACC's lexical material links Bashmu with Ushumgal, dragon, and distinguishes Ushumgalu as great dragon. That alone suggests elevation. The creature is no longer merely identified by its form, it is magnified by rank. The Marduk prayer corpus makes this even clearer. In those texts, Marduk is called the Ushumagalu dragon of the Anunnaki gods, the Ushumagalu dragon of all the deities, the Ushumagalu dragon of the great heavens, and the Ushumagalu dragon of the heavens and the earth. That is an extraordinary use of dragon language. Here the dragon is not just beside the god is the dragon, or at least bears the dragon title as a sign of overwhelming authority. Another scholarly discussion of the term notes that Ushumgalu functioned as a royal and divine epithet, which tells us that by this point we are not dealing only with zoology, mythic beast lists or cult animals. We are dealing with a prestige vocabulary. Ushumgalu is the dragon turned into sovereignty. It is the reptilian shape of majesty itself. That difference is worth lingering over, because it helps sort the three forms in the mind. Bashmu is the serpent monster nearest to poison, chaos, and the deep. Mushushu is the composite snake dragon nearest to cult symbolism, public representation, and divine attendance. Ushumgalu is the great dragon nearest to title, rank, exaltation, and royal divine language. Of course, the boundaries blur. Mesopotamian tradition enjoys blurring them. The lexical overlap is real, and the same broad dragon logic runs through all three. But their emphases differ, and that difference tells us how flexible the serpent form had become. It could still be a dangerous beast from the primordial waters. It could become a sacred creature emblazoned on monumental gateways. It could rise further still and become an epithet fit for the chief god of Babylon. That is not confusion. That is symbolic success. The serpent had proved itself useful enough to carry multiple grades of power. There is also a strong visual distinction at work. The Bashmu, even when it acquires monstrous features, remains close to the logic of the horned viper or serpent. It feels elongated, venomous, and unstable, a creature of strike and dread. The Mushushu feels more composite and more heraldic. It has lion forelegs, bird hind legs, a snake-like body, horns, and a more standardized temple and palace appearance. It is almost the dragon after being made legible for empire. Ushumgalu, meanwhile, often feels less like a fixed image than a prestige category, though some traditions and discussions connect it to lion dragon imagery. That is why the term can move so easily into prayer and epithet. It is a dragon in the register of greatness, rather than one mandatory body shape. Even a modern person can feel the difference instinctively. One creature coils in the dark water. One strides in glazed brick across Babylon's gate. One echoes in hymns as a title of Marduk that stretches from the heavens to the earth. Three dragons, if we use the word loosely, but three very different ways of making power visible. And perhaps this is why the phrase serpents of power fits them so well. These are not merely beasts of terror, they are beasts through which power announces itself. The Bashmu says that danger is ancient and venomous. The Mushushu says that divine authority has mastered danger and now displays it openly. Ushumgalu says that the dragon principle itself has become a language of greatness fit for gods and kings. In each case, the serpent body does slightly different work. It can warn, it can guard, it can glorify, it can legitimize, it can remind everyone watching that the sacred world does not rule through softness alone. This is one of the reasons Mesopotamian religion remains so compelling. It understood that symbols are strongest when they still retain the power to unsettle. A completely domesticated sacred beast is not much use. A sacred beast that still looks as though it could ruin a city if the hierarchy ever slipped, that is much more persuasive. Seen that way, the Bashmu's role becomes clearer rather than blurrier. It is not overshadowed by the Mushushu or dissolved into Ushumgalu. It anchors the whole family in primal serpent danger. Without something like the Bashmu, the later serpent dragons risk becoming too polished, too imperial, too successfully absorbed into official religion. The Bashmu keeps the memory of where this language began. It preserves the poison, the sea, the chaos side, the old uncertainty. The Mushushu and Ushumgalu then show what happens when that same fear is mastered, stylized, elevated, and turned into sacred prestige. In a sense, the whole development of Mesopotamian dragon imagery can be felt across these creatures. First, fear is named. Then fear is harnessed. Then fear becomes a title of glory. That is a remarkable journey for a serpent, even by the standards of ancient religion, and it explains why the Bashmu never feels redundant even when more famous beasts stand beside it. It is the memory underneath them. There is one final point that makes all this even richer. These serpent beasts are not only compared to one another within myth, they also move across cities, dynasties, and theological systems. Tishbak's snake dragon can become Marduk's. Marduk's beast can also be associated with Nabu. Dragon language can move from creature to emblem to epithet. That mobility tells us that Mesopotamian religion was not static. It was historical. As cities rose, gods rose. As gods rose, their beasts rose with them. The result is that these creatures carry memory not only of mythic battles, but of real political and cultic change. The dragon on a gate is also a record of a city's claim to supremacy. The dragon title in a hymn is also a sign of theological centralization. The serpent from the deep is also a reminder that even the most polished empire still built its sacred language from older fears that never really disappeared. And once that is clear, the next movement of the story becomes very natural, because a family of beasts this powerful was never going to remain trapped inside its own age. Sooner or later, the dragon had to survive beyond the old temples, beyond the empires, and into memory itself. Some monsters disappear because they are too narrow. They belong to one story, one local fear, one passing fashion in a religious world that keeps changing. The Bashmu did not disappear so easily because it was never only one thing. It was a venomous serpent, a chaos creature, a divine associate, a protective figure in later usage, a learned lexical entry, a visual type, and eventually part of astral imagination as well. In other words, it did not survive across centuries by remaining frozen. It survived by being useful to very different kinds of people for very different reasons. Priests could name it, scribes could copy it, kings could borrow its force, artists could shape it, worshippers could fear it, scholars could classify it, astronomers could lift its image into the sky. That is usually how old beings endure, not by staying pure, but by proving adaptable without losing their edge. At the beginning of its long life, the Bashmu survives because it is attached to the biggest possible story. In the Babylonian creation epic, Bashmu appears among the fearsome creatures generated for Tiamat's side of the cosmic conflict, listed alongside other monstrous beings in the war that ends with Marduk's victory and the ordering of the world. That placement matters enormously. A creature that enters the creation story does not remain provincial for long. It becomes part of how a civilization explains why order exists at all. Once the dragon is tied to the struggle between primordial disorder and divine kingship, it is no longer a local curiosity. It belongs to the grammar of the universe. People may forget smaller beasts, but they do not easily forget the forms through which the cosmos itself was imagined. But that alone would not have been enough. Ancient creation myths can be copied for a while, and still lose their creatures if those creatures never leave the page. The Bashmu lasted because it did leave the page. It entered the learned traditions that Mesopotamian scribes cared about so much. The lexical evidence preserved in ORACC defines Bashmu as a mythical poisonous snake, and ORACC's corpus summaries show the term still appearing in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian material. That may sound technical, but it is one of the strongest forms of cultural survival there is. A name that keeps being copied in learned context does not have to rely on one priest's memory or one storyteller's talent. It becomes part of education. It enters the archive. It can be encountered again by later generations who may no longer share exactly the same mythology, but still inherit the vocabulary. The Bashmu survived because Mesopotamia was a civilization of copying, and copied things live longer than spoken things alone. There is also the matter of transformation, and this may be the real secret. By the time we reach later Mesopotamian usage, the dragon does not survive only as an enemy. Black and Green note that by Assyrian times the figure identified as Bashmu was often a magically protective type. That is an extraordinary shift, but a very understandable one. A terrifying serpent can last longer in culture if it becomes useful to the side of order. Once a creature is no longer only what threatens the house, but also what helps guard the house when placed under sacred control, it gains a second career. It stops being trapped in the past tense of myth and enters the ongoing present of ritual and apotropaic practice. Human beings are remarkably willing to keep old monsters around if those monsters can be made to work for them. The Bashmu's survival across centuries was helped by exactly that change. It was fear converted into protection without ever becoming ordinary. That pattern becomes even clearer when we look at the gods. In Mesopotamia, serpent and dragon imagery did not remain permanently exiled to the side of chaos. Black and Green describe the snake dragon as a beast transferred among high-ranking gods, including Marduk and Nabu in Babylonia and Ashur in Assyria, and they also note that Tishbak's animal symbol was probably the snake dragon. Meanwhile, ORACC's entry on Marduk says the animal that often represents him is the Mushushu, the snake dragon, and the same black and green material ties the growth of Marduk's cult to the political rise of Babylon itself. This is one of the strongest reasons dragon imagery endured. It attached itself to winners. When a beast becomes linked to major gods, especially gods whose cities become imperial capitals, the beast gains institutional support. It gets temples, images, processions, hymns, craftsmen, and royal sponsorship. A dragon tied only to an obscure local cult may fade. A dragon tied to Marduk, Nabu, Babylon, and later Assyrian adaptation has a far better chance of outliving dynasties. This is where the Mushushu helps us understand the Bashmu survival, even though the two are not identical creatures. The Mushushu shows what happens when serpent dragon power becomes monumental and public. The Metropolitan Museum explains that the Ishtar Gate, built by Nebuchadnezzar II, was decorated with bulls and dragons as symbols of Adad and Marduk, and that the processional way north of the gate was lined with glazed relief figures. Black and Green likewise note the repeated appearance of the snake dragon on the Ishtar Gate and processional way. Once dragon imagery stands on the main ceremonial route of the greatest city in Babylonia, it is no longer hidden in specialist literature. It becomes urban memory. You do not need to read a difficult tablet to know the dragon matters when it is marching past you in glazed brick on the way into Babylon. That visibility gives serpent beasts a durability that purely textual monsters rarely achieve. They become part of what empire looks like. And Babylon itself was an excellent machine for preserving memory. The Met's historical overview notes that Babylon rose to prominence under Hammurabi, remained the most important city in southern Iraq until the time of Alexander, was rebuilt magnificently under Nebuchadnezzar II, and continued in importance even after Persian conquest. That long urban life matters because symbols tied to durable cities live longer than symbols tied only to fleeting political moments. The dragon survived partly because Babylon survived, and Babylon survived partly because each new regime had reasons to keep using, restoring, or reinterpreting the city's sacred language. Even when Babylon fell under outside powers, its prestige remained strong enough that conquerors sought legitimacy there. If a city remains culturally central, the creatures attached to its chief god remain hard to erase. The dragon also survived because it moved into personal and cultic devotion, not just public architecture. Black and Green describe Nabu standing on his snake dragon, and note that occasionally the god himself, or his symbol, is shown riding on the back of one. They also mention a cylinder dedicated to Marduk meant to be attached to his cult statue, showing the god and his snake dragon together. These are not trivial artistic details. They show the beast living in multiple scales of religious life, from monumental decoration to the cult statue in a temple to smaller amuletic and devotional contexts. A creature that exists at all those levels can survive changes better than one confined to a single medium. If political art declines, ritual may preserve it. If ritual weakens, scholarly copying may preserve it. If temple life changes, monumental remains may still carry it forward. The dragon remained present because it had spread out through the system. There is another pathway of survival that is easy to underestimate because it feels less dramatic, but it may be one of the most powerful of all: astronomy. Black and Green state that Ningazida's symbol and beast was the horned snake, or dragon, and that astrologically he was associated with the constellation we know as Hydra. A more recent scholarly summary of the Labu myth adds that Enlil drew the image of this huge Bashmu in the sky, likely referring to Hydra. Once serpent power reaches the heavens, memory gains a new kind of durability. A story can be forgotten, but a constellation keeps returning. A beast that is also a figure in the sky enters calendar, omen, and learned observation. That is a much more stable home than a single narrative alone. Mesopotamian culture was deeply invested in astral knowledge, so dragon imagery that migrated upward had every chance of being preserved by the same scholarly tradition that tracked stars, omens, and ritual time. The Bashmu survived because the ancient world did not leave it on the ground. It gave it a place overhead. And because Mesopotamian religion loved inheritance, the dragon could carry old meanings into new settings without needing to stay exactly the same. Ningishzida remained connected to horned serpents and Hydra. Ninazu was still remembered as king of the snakes in old Babylonian incantations. Tiamat's brood preserved the primordial side of serpent terror. Marduk and Nabu monumentalized the dragon in Babylonian state religion. These are not repetitions of one fixed idea. They are connected reuses. The creature survives because each age finds a slightly different function for serpent power. One period stresses chaos, another stresses protection, another stresses divine kingship, another keeps the image alive in astral learning. Survival, then, is not a matter of cultural stubbornness alone. It is a matter of symbolic flexibility. The Bashmu endured because it could mean more than one thing without becoming meaningless. There is a broader human reason behind all this as well. Dragon figures survive because they sit at the point where instinct and theology meet. People fear serpents very easily. That does not need much explanation. But once a culture with strong religious imagination takes that fear and enlarges it into divine politics, cosmic conflict, underworld symbolism, and royal art, the result becomes very hard to dislodge. The dragon is memorable because it is both physical and conceptual. You can picture it immediately, yet it can also carry enormous abstract weight. It can mean poison, hidden attack, old water, primeval rebellion, divine authority. The the guarded threshold, or the prestige of empire. Few symbols are that efficient. Mesopotamia kept returning to serpent beasts because they kept working, and because they kept working, later generations inherited them almost automatically. This is an inference from the range of uses the surviving sources preserve, but it is exactly the kind of inference those sources invite. What is especially striking is that this endurance continued even after Babylon itself had begun to shrink. The Met notes that Babylon remained important under the Persians, that Alexander intended it as an imperial capital, that Seleucia gradually supplanted it, and that the city's temple institutions nevertheless continued as some of the last centres of cuneiform scholarship. The same essay states that the last dated cuneiform texts were made in the 1st century AD. This is an astonishingly long afterlife for a Mesopotamian symbolic world. It means that the scribal and temple culture capable of preserving old dragon names and images did not vanish when the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended. It lingered for centuries. The dragon survived because the scholars survived, and the scholars survived because temple institutions and cuneiform learning did not disappear overnight. Ancient memory is often less fragile than people assume. It can continue quietly long after political glory has moved elsewhere. Even the ruins helped. The Met records that Babylon's inscribed baked bricks were recycled into later buildings, and that memories of the site persisted into the Abbasid period. That may seem far removed from the Bashmu itself, but it is part of the same story. Symbols linked to a famous place tend to persist as long as the place remains culturally charged. Babylon never became just another anonymous mound. It remained Babylon, a name with a stormous religious and literary gravity. And because the dragon had become part of Babylon's visual and sacred identity, that identity continued to echo even when the old cultic world had changed. Memory does not always preserve full theological precision. Often it preserves atmosphere first. The dragon endured partly because Babylon endured as an atmosphere of greatness, ruin, sanctity, and ancient prestige. So why did the dragon survive across centuries? Because it was never forced to rely on one channel of memory. It lived in epic. It lived in lexical lists. It lived in temple symbolism. It lived in royal art. It lived in protective magic. It lived in the sky. It lived beside gods whose importance grew with powerful cities. It lived in the habits of scholars who kept copying old names long after the empires that first celebrated them were gone. That combination is unusually strong. A creature embedded in only one story may vanish with that story's audience. A creature embedded in an entire civilization's ways of seeing danger, holiness, kingship, and the heavens has a much better chance of lasting. The Bashmu did not survive by accident. It survived because Mesopotamia built too many homes for it. And once a dragon has survived that long, once it has moved from primordial waters to glazed brick, from chaos host to temple beast, from ritual fear to astral figure, the next question becomes harder and more interesting at the same time, because a creature with that much staying power begins to seem like more than decoration, which is exactly where the old argument opens up again. Whether the Bashmu was only a symbol shaped by human imagination, or whether symbols like this keep surviving because they preserve some older memory people were never entirely able to forget. By the time people ask whether the Bashmu was symbolic or a memory of something older, they are usually asking two different questions at once, even if they do not realise it. One question is the modern one. Was there, at some point in the ancient Near East, a real creature behind the story, something zoological, something that once moved through the reeds or marshes or coastal waters strongly enough to leave an impression that later turned into a dragon? The other question is older and, in many ways, more interesting. When Mesopotamians spoke of a being like the Bashmu, were they only inventing a monster for myth, or were they preserving some older human memory about danger, chaos, and the shape of power? Those are not the same question. A symbol is not necessarily false, and a memory is not necessarily literal. The Bashmu sits exactly in that middle ground, where ancient religion, human fear, and very old cultural memory all overlap. The safest scholarly answer is that the Bashmu is a mythological serpent or dragon being, not evidence for a forgotten biological species. In lexical and mythological tradition, it is treated as a mythical poisonous snake, associated with Tiamat's side of the cosmic struggle, and even described in one literary fragment as a chaos serpent of immense size that consumes living things until the gods intervene. That places it squarely inside mythic thought rather than natural history. But that does not make the creature empty. This is where modern people sometimes flatten the past without meaning to. We hear the word symbolic and assume it means unreal in the weak sense, as though the ancient mind was simply making things up for decoration. Mesopotamian religion did not use symbols that way. Its symbols were heavy. They were built from things people actually feared, things people actually saw, and forces they actually felt pressing on daily life. The Bashmu may not be a memory of a literal dragon in the biological sense, but it clearly preserves memory of real serpents, real venom, real floodwater, real unseen danger, and the very real human problem of trying to build order in a world that can turn hostile very quickly. That much is visible in the creature's own profile. It is serpent-shaped, poison-linked, born from the sea in one tradition, aligned with chaos in another, and fearsome enough that even its comparative use in texts communicates awe and threat. The symbol is working because it is built from recognisably dangerous parts of the world. That is the first kind of older memory the Bashmu carries, environmental memory. Mesopotamia did not invent serpents in order to explain danger. It lived with them already. Southern Mesopotamia was a landscape of rivers, canals, marshes, reeds, fields, mud brick settlements, and shifting waters. In such a world, snakes are not abstract. They are part of the physical environment. They hide well, strike suddenly, and in venomous forms kill in ways that feel invisible and unfair. Once a civilization grows up inside that sort of landscape, serpent fear becomes one of the easiest building blocks for larger stories. A real snake bites one person. A mythic serpent explains why danger always seems to lie just beyond the edge of cultivated order. So if the Bashmu preserves an old memory, the most obvious one is not of some lost dinosaur wandering around temple courtyards. It is of generations of human beings who knew exactly what it meant to share land with dangerous snakes, and to feel that nature itself still had sharp corners. Civilization had not sanded down. This is an inference from the broader symbolic field around snakes in Mesopotamia, but it is a grounded one. The old texts themselves preserve the creature as serpent, poisonous and fearsome, which only makes sense because the serpent form already carried that charge. The second older memory is civilizational rather than zoological. The Bashmu remembers what the world felt like before order was secure. That is why the Tiamat connection matters so much. In the Babylonian creation story, the Bashmu belongs among the monsters associated with the side of primordial revolt, one of the beings through which chaos becomes active and dangerous. The scholarly discussion of the term in Jonathan Valk's article is very clear on this point. Bashmu is a mythical creature aligned with efforts to subvert divine order, appears among Tiamat's monsters in Enuma Elish, and in another literary fragment is a chaos serpent so destructive that the gods must step in to stop it. That is not just a story about a beast. It is a story about what existence feels like before boundaries are settled. The Bashmu therefore carries memory of an old human truth. Order is made, not given. Cities have to be built, canals have to be maintained, fields have to be defended, kingship has to justify itself. The dragon is what all of that work is being done against. Seen that way, the Bashmu is a memory of something older than any one empire. It remembers a stage of thought in which the world is imagined as barely held together. That is one reason dragon figures survive so stubbornly. They are good at storing the sense that beneath roads, walls, laws, and temples, there is still a more dangerous version of reality waiting. Mesopotamia knew exactly that feeling. Floods, invasion, collapse, disease, crop failure, and political violence were not theoretical possibilities. They were recurring facts. So when the culture put a horned, venomous, sea-born serpent into its myths, it was not escaping reality. It was compressing reality. The Bashmu becomes one body for many experiences. Water that destroys, snakes that kill, kingship that can fail, and the old fear that what was once chaotic may become chaotic again. That is symbolic, yes, but it is symbolic in the ancient heavy-duty sense, where the symbol is a compact machine for carrying memory across generations. There is also a third kind of older memory here, and that one belongs to religion itself. The Bashmu was not left behind in one early myth and forgotten. It kept being copied, named, and reworked. Anunnaki preserves lexical evidence identifying Bashmu as a mythical poisonous snake, while broader scholarly work shows that the being continues to appear in mythological, learned, and protective contexts over long stretches of Mesopotamian history. Black and green note that by Assyrian times the figure identified as Bashmu was often used as a magically protective type. The same creature, then, can begin as a terror and later stand on the side of order under divine control. That sort of survival is not accidental. It means the Bashmu had entered cultural memory deeply enough that later Mesopotamians could still do things with it. They could reinterpret it, deploy it, and place it in ritual space. A creature that lasts that long is no longer just a one-time invention. It becomes inherited material. In that sense, the Bashmu is certainly a memory of something older, because every later use of it is remembering earlier uses, even when the meaning shifts. This is where the question gets especially good, because a remembered symbol is not the same thing as a remembered animal. The Bashmu may not preserve a fossilized report of an actual dragon, but it absolutely preserves the memory of older mythic systems. It remembers serpent gods, underworld associations, cosmic combat traditions, and the old Mesopotamian habit of treating dangerous beings as structurally important rather than merely scary. ORACC's entries on Ninazu and Ningishzida help here. Ninazu is called King of the Snakes in your 3 and Old Babylonian incantations, while Ningishzida is described as a chthonic deity associated with vegetation, growth and decay, snakes and demons. These are not marginal details. They show that serpent power had deep roots in the divine world long before any modern person arrived asking whether a dragon was real. The Bashmu belongs to that older sacred environment. It is a memory of the time when snakes were not just creatures in the field, but markers of underworld force, hidden authority, fertility, decay, and the uneasy border between life and death. And then there is the sky. Once a dragon reaches the heavens, memory changes again. The constellation tradition linked Bashmu with the celestial snake identified with Hydra, and later scholarly discussion preserves additional astral imagery in which Marduk and a Bashmu appear within the sun. This does not make the creature more literal. It makes it harder to lose. A story can fade, but a figure in the sky returns night after night. The heavens give symbols a second archive. They make them recurring. If a community teaches its children that this long shape among the stars is the serpent, then the dragon is no longer preserved only in tablets or temples. It is preserved overhead. That is one of the strongest reasons Mesopotamian serpent beasts endured. They moved into astronomy, Oman thought, and the visual habits of looking upward. So if the Bashmu is a memory of something older, it is also a memory that has been pinned to the sky to keep it from slipping away. Now, because your series likes to sit right on the line between scholarship and the larger questions people keep asking after midnight, it is worth going one step further and asking whether there could be any deeper human memory behind creatures like this. Not evidence, exactly, but pressure. Why do serpent dragons recur so often in old cultures? Why do they feel older than the stories that contain them? Here I think the best answer is not that ancient Mesopotamians were secretly describing a surviving prehistoric monster. There is no solid evidence for that, and the surviving sources point much more strongly toward mythological construction than zoological reporting. But there may well be a deeper human memory underneath the form, and it is one that has nothing to do with hidden dinosaurs. Human beings are primed to fear serpents. We notice them fast. We remember them. They strike without warning. Some kill by venom rather than obvious physical force. They belong to edges, holes, waterlines, and ruins. They are, in short, excellent raw material for myth. The dragon may simply be what happens when that ancient human fear is enlarged until it becomes big enough to carry cosmic meaning. That is not lesser than a literal memory. In many ways it is more interesting because it means the Bashmu is built from one of the oldest alarm systems the human body has. That is why symbolic does not feel like a reduction here. The Bashmu is symbolic the way a king's crown is symbolic, or a city wall is symbolic, or a grave is symbolic. It stands for something, yes, but the thing it stands for is concrete. Poison, sudden attack, the deep sea, flood water, the unstable past, the fear that old disorder may return, the authority of gods who can master serpent force, the memory of rites meant to hold danger at bay, the possibility that what humans call civilization is always one step away from the things it claims to have defeated. That is a very full kind of symbolism. It has dirt on it. It has teeth. It is not decorative. And because it is so full, it can survive historical change. The Bashmu can move from Tiamat's brood to divine attendance, from terrifying myth to protective usage, from tablet to sky, because the symbol is rich enough to keep doing work. There is also a temptation, especially in modern alternative history circles, to assume that if a symbol is old and widespread, it must preserve some once literal event. Sometimes that happens. More often, what survives is not an event but a pattern. The Bashmu may preserve the pattern of human encounters with dangerous serpents, unstable waters, and the hard labour of forcing order onto a threatening world. It may preserve the pattern of watching kings claim power by defeating chaos, or gods claim supremacy by subduing monsters. It may preserve the pattern of religious systems adopting the thing they once feared and turning it into sacred property. Those are all forms of memory, and they are often stronger than factual recollection because they repeat. An empire falls and the next one still needs a dragon. A city changes gods, and the new chief god still wants a serpent beast nearby. A temple rewrites a story and still keeps the old shape of danger in place. That kind of repetition is not a historical accident. It is memory behaving like architecture. So was the Bashmu symbolic. Yes, absolutely. The sources support that. It is a mythological serpent or dragon being used to express chaos, fear, divine power, and later protection. Was it a memory of something older? Also, yes, if we mean that in the deeper and more defensible sense. It remembers real snakes. It remembers real danger from water and wilderness. It remembers the oldest Mesopotamian way of imagining the world before order. It remembers serpent gods and underworld power. It remembers cultural layers older than Babylon itself. It remembers through ritual and astronomy how ancient people refused to let such a form disappear. What it does not clearly preserve is the field report of an actual dragon species once stalking the Euphrates. That idea is attractive because it feels dramatic, but the evidence we have points elsewhere. The Bashmu is better understood as a memory machine than a fossil report. It stores the ancient Near East's oldest feelings about danger in a body people could not easily forget. And maybe that is why the creature still feels so alive now. A literal beast can die and stay dead. A symbol built from repeated human experience is much harder to bury. It keeps returning because the conditions that made it still exist in some form. People still fear what strikes suddenly. They still fear poison that works unseen. They still build order against larger forces they do not fully control. They still turn danger into stories big enough to carry it. The Bashmu survives because it was made from those habits. It was never just a monster on a tablet. It was a way of remembering that the world has always contained things older than walls, older than kings, older than certainty, and that human beings, whether in a mud brick city on the Euphrates or in a room lit by a screen very late at night, keep giving those things scales so they can look back at them without blinking first. By the time we arrive here, after all the old names and old tablets and all the long turns through temples, chaos, serpent gods and Babylonian memory, the Bashmu feels less like a creature we met in one story, and more like something that was always there in the background. That, I think, is why ancient dragons linger so well in the mind. They do not behave like ordinary characters. A king may rise and fall, a city may shine and then break. A temple may be restored, abandoned, plundered, rebuilt, and eventually turned into dust. But a serpent from the deep, a creature tied to poison, old water, and the first dangerous version of the world, has a different kind of staying power. It can keep turning up because it belongs to a question much older than any one empire. What was here before order? What waits beneath order? And how much of that old danger still remains under the surface, even after walls are built and gods are named and scribes have done their very best to classify everything that ought to have been classifiable? If the Bashmu once coiled beneath the ancient world, then it did so in more than one sense. It may not have been there as a literal animal of impossible size sleeping beneath every city like an annoyed landmine of mythology, waiting for a dramatic cue. The evidence does not ask us to believe that. But in another, more interesting way, it absolutely did coil beneath that world. It lay underneath Mesopotamian ideas about danger, underneath the fear of what rose from marshes, from rivers, from the sea, from cracks in the ground, from old stories, from divine anger, and from the uncomfortable awareness that human beings never fully control the places where they live. That is one of the reasons the Bashmu matters. It is not only a dragon. It is a way of admitting that order always has an underside. Mesopotamia knew that better than most civilizations. It was a place of extraordinary skill and extraordinary vulnerability. The same people who built canals, tracked stars, wrote laws, organized cities, and raised temple towers also lived with floodplain instability, political upheaval, disease, drought, war, and the steady fact that nature and power both had sharp edges. It would have been stranger if such a civilization had not imagined great dangerous beings under the skin of the world. The Bashmu belongs to that kind of realism. It says that what humans build is meaningful, but never beyond threat. The fields are real. The city walls are real. The temple rites are real. The king's authority is real. But the old deep things are real too, at least in the sense that the fears and forces they represent remain present. That is why the Bashmu can feel both mythical and practical at once. It is too large to be ordinary, but too grounded in lived human anxiety to feel empty. And perhaps that is the quiet thought that keeps returning at night. Ancient people were not so different in this respect. They built structures around themselves, both physical and mental, because the world did not come ready-made as a safe place. They made homes, they made cities, they made gods into rulers of those cities, they made rituals to defend thresholds, they named monsters, they placed protective beings near doors and gates. They looked at the sky and gave hostile shapes their place among the stars. All of that effort tells you something simple and very human. The fear never vanished completely. It was managed, organized, ritualized, turned into story and symbol, but not erased. The Bashmu is one of the clearest reminders of that. It is what fear looks like after a civilization has spent centuries thinking about it carefully. There is something almost comforting in that, oddly enough. Not comforting because dragons are relaxing, obviously. One would not want one in the pantry. but comforting because the ancient world does not pretend safety was ever automatic. It does not insult anyone with the suggestion that everything will be fine if you simply think positively and maintain good posture. It accepts that the world contains danger, then gets to work. Build the canal, raise the wall, speak the incantation, make the offering, copy the tablet, name the serpent, put the creature on the gate, place the god above it. In other words, live anyway, organize anyway, sleep anyway, as best you can. There is a sober kindness in that view of life. It does not deny the Bashmu. It places the Bashmu inside a larger order and says, yes, this too must be accounted for. When people now imagine ancient Mesopotamia, they often think first of kings and ziggurats, and perhaps the hanging gardens that may or may not have been exactly where later tradition wanted them to be. But underneath all of that was a more fundamental effort, which was the effort to keep chaos from having the last word. The Bashmu stands for the opposite of that effort. Not because it is evil in some later moralized sense, but because it belongs to the side of reality that does not care whether human arrangements survive. It is the deep thing, the venomous thing, the thing from before. And what makes it such a strong image is that every civilization knows some version of that creature. It may not call it Bashmu. It may not give it horns or 7 tongues or place it among Tiamat's host. But every culture knows the feeling that something older and less cooperative lies beneath the neat version of the world. Sometimes that feeling comes from water. Rivers flood, seas rise. Storms erase plans very quickly. Sometimes it comes from disease, which behaves with the same rude disregard for human scheduling that venomous creatures seem to represent so well. Sometimes it comes from politics, from violence, from the sudden collapse of institutions people thought were permanent. Sometimes it comes from the body itself, when illness arrives from within and reminds a person that not all threats come from outside the walls. In each case, the Bashmu still works as an image because it was never just a reptile with ambitions. It was a body built to carry the idea of intrusion, danger, instability, and the old world pressing upward through the newer one. That may also be why the Bashmu survive so well in memory, even when far more detailed creatures are forgotten. Many ancient beings have names no one remembers because they belong to narrow ritual contexts or specialized local traditions. The Bashmu lasted because it touched something broader. It took very old human concerns and gave them a shape that was hard to misplace. A serpent is already memorable. A serpent enlarged into dragon form is more memorable still. Add poison, sea origin, chaos, divine conflict, and later sacred adaptation, and now you have a creature with enough symbolic weight to travel across centuries without losing all its force. That is not accidental. People remember what helps them think. The Bashmu helped Mesopotamia think about what lay outside order and what might still be underneath it. I think that is also why the line between symbol and memory never fully closes around creatures like this. A great many modern arguments begin by asking whether the dragon was real, as though reality could only mean bones and scales and a place in a zoological catalogue. Ancient thought was often sharper than that. A thing could be symbolically real and therefore socially, emotionally, ritually and politically powerful. The Bashmu was real enough to appear in incantations, lists, myths, protective uses, divine associations and artistic traditions. It was real enough to shape how danger was described. It was real enough to help make sense of cosmic struggle. That is a kind of reality modern people often underestimate simply because it does not leave behind a skeleton in the usual way. But symbols, especially ancient ones, do leave remains. They leave text, image, architecture, ritual traces, titles, and habits of thought. The Bashmu left all of those. If we imagine for a moment that it once coiled beneath the ancient world, then perhaps the most accurate image is not a literal dragon asleep under Babylon, though I admit that would make for a memorable excavation report. It is something more structural. The Bashmu coils beneath the city the way uncertainty coils beneath confidence, the way floodwater coils beneath irrigation, the way death coils beneath kingship, the way the underworld coils beneath the field that seems so stable in daylight, the way old fear coils beneath every refined theology that claims to have organized the cosmos once and for all. In that sense, the Bashmu is not under one city only. It is under all of them, under Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Eshnunna, Nineveh, and every other place where human beings looked at what they had built and knew, privately or publicly, that it could be unbuilt. This is not a gloomy thought. Not really. It is a realistic one, and realism can be strangely calming when it's spoken gently enough. Ancient Mesopotamians did not appear to believe that the answer to danger was denial. They believed the answer was order, ritual, memory, and proper relation to the divine. Their myths say the world is threatened, yes, but also that it has been shaped. Their temples say the gods dwell here, therefore the city is not abandoned. Their rituals say danger has names and limits. Their protective figures say the gate is watched. Their astronomy says even the serpent has its place in the sky. None of this removes the Bashmu from existence entirely. Instead, it does something wiser. It places the Bashmu in a universe where even danger can be named, subordinated, remembered, and watched. And perhaps that is the deepest reason the dragon became sacred as well as feared. What is most dangerous often becomes most meaningful. People do not build their richest symbolic systems out of things they barely notice. They build them out of what they cannot ignore. The serpent was impossible to ignore. Venom was impossible to ignore. Chaos was impossible to ignore. Water was impossible to ignore. So the Bashmu became one of the shapes in which all of that could be gathered up and made legible. Later it could even be turned, at least in some contexts, toward protection. That is a very human move. Once a threat has been defeated or mastered, it becomes useful as an emblem of the power that defeated it. So the dragon survives not despite being dangerous, but because it never stopped being dangerous. A harmless dragon would not be worth the stone. There is something worth lingering on here as the night goes on. The Bashmu is old, but its function is familiar. Human beings still give shape to what they fear. They still turn uncertainty into images, stories, and systems. They still build protective routines around things they cannot fully control. The details change. The old incantation becomes a new habit. The temple becomes another sort of institution. The threshold charm becomes a lock, a camera, a medicine cabinet, a checklist, a diagnosis, a password, a quiet prayer before sleep. The forms shift, but the instinct stays recognizable. Name the danger. Understand the danger. Put boundaries around the danger. Sleep if you can. Wake and go on. In that sense, the distance between ancient Mesopotamia and the present becomes smaller than people often imagine. The Bashmu also reminds us that ancient people were not childish for thinking in monsters. They were sophisticated enough to know that monsters are useful. A monster gathers scattered experiences into one image that can be remembered and transmitted. It gives scale to a problem. It helps a culture say that danger is not random, not always personal, and not always small. The Bashmu says all that with remarkable efficiency. It is bigger than one snake bite, and older than one war. It is the serpent enlarged until it can carry civilizational weight. Once you understand that, the dragon stops seeming like an embarrassment from the pre-scientific past and starts looking like a very smart piece of cultural engineering. And yet, for all that seriousness, there is still something pleasantly strange about the whole thing. Somewhere in the oldest city-building landscape on Earth, people looked at the world and said, more or less, yes, there is administration and law, and grain accounting and temple offerings, and astronomy, and irrigation schedules, but also there are ancient venomous dragon serpents from the deep, and we need to account for those too. One has to admire the range. Civilizations are at their most interesting when they refuse to simplify themselves, and Mesopotamia rarely did. It could be practical and mythic at once. It could classify plants and demons with equal concentration. It could build a canal and preserve a chaos serpent on a tablet in the same general cultural breath. The Bashmu belongs to that wide-minded seriousness. It is one more sign that the ancient world was not divided between rational people and imaginative people. It was full of people who understood that imagination was one of the tools required for handling reality. So if the Bashmu once coiled beneath the ancient world, perhaps the final quiet thought is this: the creature did not remain beneath it because the world above it was false. The cities were real. The gods were real to their worshippers. The rituals were real actions. The laws, crops, palaces, workshops and riverboats were all real enough. But beneath every organised world lies the memory of what organisation is trying to hold back. The Bashmu is that memory-given body. It is not a denial of civilization. It is civilization's shadow, acknowledged openly. And there is something honest in a culture willing to admit that its order stands over depth. That honesty may be why the Bashmu still feels alive when quieter creatures from the same world have long since gone still. The dragon from the deep continues to speak because it speaks about a condition that has not changed. People still live above things they do not fully understand. They still build confidence over uncertainty. They still need names for what threatens the fragile arrangements of daily life. They still stare at the night and wonder whether the world is truly tamed or merely behaving itself for the moment. Ancient Mesopotamia answered that question with temples, gods, rituals, kings, walls and dragons. Not because it thought the dragon would disappear, but because it knew the dragon had to be included in the picture. And perhaps that is a good place to let the mind rest for a while, not on the image of a beast leaping out of the dark to ruin the evening, but on the quieter idea that even the oldest fears can be named, studied, placed, and carried without being denied. The Bashmu remains where it has always been, somewhere beneath the polished surface of human order, deep in the old language of danger and memory, coiled not to interrupt every moment, but simply to remind the world above it what its foundations are made of and how long people have been learning to live above them.